Section 1 of Weird Tales presents The Strange World of Harry Houdini. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. Weird Tales presents The Strange World of Harry Houdini. Houdini, the internationally famous mystifier who has baffled the public, the shrewdest police, and the leading scientists of this and other countries for the past 20 years, herewith presents a story of his adventure never before recorded. It is with pleasure that the publishers of this magazine are able to announce that more stories of the adventures of Houdini will appear in succeeding issues, none of which have ever before appeared in print. Houdini has always been profoundly interested in spiritualistic and psychic phenomena. He has personally known most of the leading spiritualists of the last 30 years, and strange to say, they are all intensely interested in Houdini from the fact that Houdini has never failed to duplicate any feat of so-called spiritualistic phenomena. He has never been able to discover one solitary fact that would convince him of spirit communication, and years ago he made solemn compacts with 14 of his closest friends that the one first to die would communicate with the survivor through an agreed signal. The 14 have passed on, and Houdini still awaits their messages in respectful seriousness. Volumes can be written of the various feats performed by this master of escape. Most of them are well known to practically everyone who has seen Houdini in his numerous appearances before the American public. No man living today could equal Houdini in assembling a crowd if it were announced that Houdini would attempt one of his miraculous escapes. But Houdini has had some remarkable adventures and has effected some desperate escapes that were not advertised beforehand. He has traveled to every nook and corner of the globe, and in his notebook are recorded some of his personal experiences in different climes that, if one were not acquainted with the ability of the man, would sound like fiction of the most imaginative sort. Some of these personal experiences will appear in future issues of Weird Tales. They will deal with revengeful crooks who have been exposed by Houdini and who literally stopped at no means to be revenged on him. They will set forth the extreme measures resorted to by avaricious scoundrels in their attempts to wrest from Houdini the secrets that have made him so famous. They will tell of traps set for him with all the skill and cunning ingenious minds could contrive. Houdini is a lover of books, and has the finest collection of psychic, spiritualistic, and dramatic works of any man in America. He has just completed a new book on the subject of fraudulent spiritualistic phenomena, A Magician Among the Spirits, Harper & Bro, and has written quite a few volumes on various subjects. He is so well known that the latest Funk and Wagnall's dictionary published the word Houdinize to get out of or escape. Dr. Frank Crane, in his syndicated daily editorials, commented recently on Houdini. He is one of the most remarkable men of his time. He is not only a famous magician, but he has a most extraordinary equipment of mind and body. He is one of the most perfect and efficient bodies in the world, a very shrewd and resourceful mind. Men like Houdini help along a good deal in the sanity of the world, by showing the public that most of the hocus-pocus put forward by people who claim to be assisted by spirits and by magic are nothing but clever tricks. In another page of this magazine will appear an announcement that Houdini will answer any rational question regarding spiritualistic or psychic phenomena, and such questions and answers that seem of general interest will be published in this magazine from time to time. The Editor. The Spirit Fakers of Hermannstadt. Part 1. By Houdini. I've been in many tight places in my varied life. I have met dangers in the most surprising forms, but I have never experienced anything more perilous and weird than when I was held captive by a group of unprincipled blackmailers in an old castle in Transylvania on the banks of the Moros River, in what was at that time part of Hungary, but was later given to Romania in the settlement that followed the World War. This adventure came to me most unexpectedly, with no hint of its dangerous character until I was fully drawn into it. I had been exhibiting my skill in various cities of Europe, and had just finished an engagement at Rohenacker's establishment in Vienna, mystifying the spectators by escaping from a triple-locked trunk into which I had been thrown manacled. I wanted to see a little of the picturesque country along the Moros River, so after my engagement at Vienna was finished, I went out alone on what was intended to be purely a pleasure trip, but which turned into as exciting and perilous an adventure as I've ever experienced. In a small village peopled mostly by Romanians, although it was in Hungary, I stayed overnight with a grocer's family, amusing the children as well as their parents by several little tricks of parlor magic. They must have noised abroad that a magician was stopping with them, for when I was about to depart the next morning, a heavily veiled woman came to see me and asked for me by name. Wondering how the woman knew who I was, I received her in the living room with the family placed at my disposal. "Mr. Houdini," she said, speaking in the Magyar tongue, "I am in great distress, and you have it in your power to help me. Will you do so?" "Madam," I replied, "if you will state your trouble frankly and clearly, I will see what can be done." She was visibly agitated and her body trembled, but the black veil hid her features. After a minute, she regained her composure. "First I must ask you," she said, "whether you believe in spiritualism." I was frankly astonished at her question. "What bearing has this on the matter?" I countered. "If you are a spiritualistic medium, then I am lost indeed," she replied. "Do you employ the spirits of the dead in your work?" I smiled. "On that score you can reassure yourself," I replied. "In all my escapes from handcuffs and trunks and jails, in fact, in everything I do, I use nothing of that sort. As for spiritualism, I neither believe nor disbelieve in it. There may be honest mediums, but so far I have never met one, nor have I ever established communication with the dead. Does that answer your question?" "Thank heaven!" exclaimed my visitor. "I am the Countess." She hesitated a minute, then resumed somewhat incoherently. "I am the Countess D., but I must ask you to respect my confidences because the honor of our house depends upon it. I would not come for help to you, a stranger, except that a disaster impends which only you can avert. Unknown to you, your name and influence have been used by an unprincipled gang of blackmailers in an attempt to extort secrets from my younger sister, Rosica. My father was a very terrible man, Mr. Houdini. Only I and my sister and an old deaf-mute caretaker know the fearful secrets of Castle D. If those secrets were related to the world, we would be shunned by all decent people, and my own hopes of happiness in this world would be killed. I am affianced to a man whom I love deeply, but he would never marry me, the daughter of such a line, if he knew the terrible secrets of our castle. Yet I am in no way tainted with my father's crimes, for I inherit my mother's face and traits. My sister inherits from my father his strength of will and his stubborn determination, but in features and character she too is like my mother, who is all sweetness. Look upon my features, Mr. Houdini, and then say whether you could believe that I am the daughter of one of the most degenerate and opprobrious villains that ever drew the breath of life." She threw back her veil, and I caught a glimpse of beauty and tender loveliness that made my breath come short. There was in her dark black eyes such a pleading wistfulness that I could not help feeling sorry for her, and though I did not know what she expected or wanted of me, I made up my mind then and there that I would aid her in every way in my power. She gazed at me thus for so many minutes that I became uneasy. "Come, madam," I said at last, "reassure yourself. I give you my word that I will help you, and you can trust me absolutely not to reveal your confidences. But I cannot imagine anything your father could have done so terrible that it would cause anyone to hate so fair and sympathetic a woman as you." "Ah, you little know," she breathed. Then with her head bowed in shame and her eyes averted from mine, she told a tale of depravity so terrible that my brows knitted in loathing, and I involuntarily clenched my fists in fierce anger to think that such creatures as this woman's father could ever exist on this fair earth of ours. I even included her in my intense loathing, as her voice broke and trailed off incoherently in the midst of the most revolting details. But when she raised her eyes again, and I saw the horror and fear in them, a great wave of pity surged over me for the unfortunate daughter of a man who could wreak such terrible barbarities upon innocent peasant girls within the dungeons of his castle. What she told me that night I am under oath never to reveal, and I cannot violate that oath. If I said that her father was a beast in human form, I would be insulting the whole animal order of creation. He was far worse, far lower than any beast. His daughter's narrative told of the disappearance of women and young girls in the blackness of night, and how the Count had organized searching parties to fool the peasants into believing that he was earnestly trying to find the women and girls who had disappeared, whereas these poor creatures in the dungeons of his castles were undergoing... But I must not forget my oath. Suffice it to say that the mother of the Count's 2 daughters died from shame and terror, and the 2 girls, my fair visitor and her sister Rosica, learning from the ravings of their dying father the truth that they already half suspected, shut themselves off in part of the castle and lived apart from the world, until recently when they had gone to Hermannstadt, where love entered the life of my visitor, the Countess D. "You see well, Mr. Houdini," the Countess continued, "that all my dreams of love and happiness will be over if these terrible secrets are found out. They must remain locked in the breasts of myself and my sister Rossica, to be buried forever in the grave when we die. Surely no man, no matter how much he might love me, could consent to link his name and family to a line accursed by such a beast as my father, the Count D. And yet he bore a good name during his life, and his memory is respected, though I cannot hope for his happiness now that he is dead." It was on the tip of my tongue to remark that nobody could refuse to forgive one so lovely for sins committed by her ancestors, but the full horror of the story she had just told me caused me to shudder, and I remained silent. "3 months ago," said the Countess D., "my sister met in Hermannstadt a noblewoman who was deeply interested in spiritualism. She took my sister to several seances and introduced her to a medium named Popkins. This medium had converted her completely to spiritualism, and he is using his influence to get from her the secrets that would ruin our line. 4 days ago she brought him to a castle which stands on the banks of the Maros River 2 leagues from here. The moment I saw him I knew that I had seen him before. Dark, with small beady eyes that showed a great deal of white, nervous hands with long fingers, a thin foppishly curled black moustache, and a horrible manner of repeatedly plucking at his beak-like chin with his left hand. There is something sinister about the man. I know that I have seen him before, and in the very castle itself, while my father was still alive. Who he is and what he knows, it is beyond my power to say. But I am certain that I have seen him before, and that he is diabolical. If I could only place him definitely, I know I could convince my sister that he is an impostor who purposes nothing good. In the last séance that my sister attended in Hermannstadt, she says he went into a trance, and my father's spirit spoke through Popkin's lips in my father's very voice, commanding her to release his soul from torment by putting into writing the whole revolting hideousness of his evil deeds on earth, as my sister had heard it from the dying lips of my conscious tortured father, in that terrible delirium that preceded his death, the terrified ravings of a fiend trying to make his peace with God before he dies. As only my sister and I and the deaf-mute caretaker attended him in his final illness, my sister is satisfied that it was really our father's spirit speaking to her. He ordered her to write out clearly and legibly everything he had told her in his delirium, and sign it in the presence of 2 other persons who would be named by him in a later séance. Of course, Rossica refused. She would take no commands from the father whose memory she loathes, but she was greatly worried. Then last night this false medium Popkins, for I'm sure he is an unprincipled impostor and adventurer, held a séance in the castle itself, which I attended. He claimed to have produced the spirit of our saintly mother. The apparition commanded Rossica to rescue our father from torment by yielding to his wishes, and it named 2 men who are to witness the affidavit of my sister, as a sign that she was indeed the spirit of our mother, speaking to us from beyond the grave. She said that she has appeared to these 2 witnesses in dreams, and they were even now on their way from Hermannstadt to witness the document that my sister Rossica was to write, although our mother's spirit had not informed them what the document was. The voice was indeed like that of our mother, but there was also a difference. It was that difference which prevented Rossica from then and there going into her bedroom and spending the rest of the night writing out a fragmentary record of my father's depravities, a record that would cause the countryside to rise against us, and mean the ending of my dream of happiness, if indeed we escaped with our lives from those whose daughters and sisters suffered from the unbelievable debaucheries perpetuated by my father. The apparition of our mother, appearing dimly in the darkened room like a wraith of mist, adjured my sister that she had no right to condemn even the worst of sinners to eternal torment, and his torment would be unending unless a record were left that might be discovered by future generations to expose his shame to the world, so that his spirit could atone. Such a written record of his misdeeds would jeopardize Rossica's happiness, said the voice, for after the document was duly witnessed, she was to bury it behind a certain stone in the famous Black Dungeon. I knew it was meant by the Black Dungeon, where in medieval times terrible tortures were inflicted, and I cringed helplessly at the thought of ever going down into that den of iniquity last visited by my father, whose death was caused by poisoning from the bite of the insane girl he kept shackled there. But with that thought sudden light came in upon me. This man, this fake medium, whom I am certain I had once seen in the castle, knew of the dungeon, knew of my father's crimes, and wanted to lay his hands upon the evidence. The men on their way from Hermannstadt to witness the document are his accomplices. They aim to obtain the document out of the dungeon after Rossica has put it there, and then blackmail us out of everything we have, for they know that both Rossica and I would give up everything and go penniless into the world before we would suffer the ignominy of being branded by the depravities of our father. The false medium Popkins professes to know nothing about what happened during his trance, but that is only to convince my sister that the communications she has received are really from her father and her mother. How Popkins knows anything about my father's crimes or about the delirium that preceded his death, I do not yet know, unless he is really a spiritualistic medium. In that case, his dealings are with bad spirits intent upon the ruin of myself and my sister. Be that as it may, my sister says that if the two witnesses from Hermannstadt arrive today, as the apparition of our mother prophesied, then she will believe that she has received a solemn command from our mother, and will prepare a record of our father's guilt. There's no earthly way, she says, by which the witnesses can be informed to come to Castle D. Popkins, she says, was in a trance and knows nothing of the communication from our mother. And even had he been conscious, he has no means of sending messages to Hermannstadt, and he has not left the castle since the seance. But if Rossica prepares this paper, then we are lost, for it will fall into the hands of the unscrupulous Popkins. When I chanced to come to the village this morning to post a letter to our solicitor in Hermannstadt, begging him to hasten to my aid, I heard that a man was here who performed tricks of magic, and from that nature I knew that it must be you. Popkins 1 week ago took Rossica to see you perform when my sister was in Hermannstadt. Rossica has told me that you are really a great spiritualistic medium, that you make supernatural escapes by spiritual aid, although you claim to do your tricks by your own skill, the better to excite the admiration of the public. I asked my sister how she knew this, and she said that Popkins had told her so. He also told her that you were once his pupil in developing your mediumistic powers. My sister saw you shackled and manacled and thrown into a trunk on the stage at Vienna, and the trunk was then locked and bound around with stout rope. A canopy was then placed around the trunk to conceal your operations from the audience, and soon you emerged from the canopy having made your escape. It seemed impossible for any man to perform such a feat by human means, Rossica said. But Popkins explained to her that you had learned how to project your spirit double, and that it was only your spirit double that went into the trunk, and that you simply materialized yourself and again became visible to the audience. My sister believed implicitly in the medium's explanation. At this point in the narrative of the Countess, I interrupted rather heatedly. "It is not true," I said. "I am not a medium, and I do not make my escapes by any such means." "I believe you," the Countess went on, "and that is just what I want to tell Rossica. She has seen you. She knows you by sight. If you will go to me to Castle D at once, we shall arrive before the accomplices from Hermannstadt get there. Tell Rossica that you are not a medium. Tell her that Popkins is a liar and an impostor. She will believe you, and the secrets of our line will then be locked within our own bosoms and yours. For I have revealed to you all of my father's secrets that I know, sparing nothing. And these secrets will perish when we perish. The noble line of D will continue, and the happiness which I seek so desperately and so selfishly will be secured. It is little that I ask, Mr. Houdini, but it means everything to me, and I shall pay you well." She held out her hands imploringly, and her eyes searched deep into mine. I told her that I could not accept her money for a favor which I was only too glad to confer. We got into a rather dilapidated calash and started for the castle. The Countess explained that she drove it herself because she wanted nobody at the castle to know of her excursion to the village. And in any case, she had only the deaf-mute to call upon, for they lived very simply in a small part of the castle, with but 2 other servants, who were man and wife, and did all the cooking and took care of the house. After a drive of slightly more than an hour, we came to Castle D, on the banks of the Maros River. The old moat was empty except for a stagnant scum that showed the presence of an inch or 2 of water, and the castle itself had been badly neglected. One wall of the castle abutted directly upon the river, which washed its base. The grounds were well kept, with smooth lawns and carefully trimmed shrubs and a profusion of roses, testifying to the loving care of the old deaf-mute. The old man saluted as the calash rolled up the dirt road and then assisted the Countess to get down from the vehicle. We went directly into the drawing room, and the Countess at once introduced me to her sister Rossica, who was talking with a dark-skinned and evil-featured man whom I rightly guessed to be Popkins the medium. I shall never forget the surprise and consternation with which he heard my name fall from the lips of the Countess. Anger, intense and overwhelming, showed on his face for an instant, and then passed completely away. He forced a broad smile to his lips and extended his hand in greeting. "Ah, Mr. Houdini," he exclaimed in passable English. "What a pleasure to meet you here. You don't remember me, do you?" I had never laid eyes on the man before that minute. The brazen effrontery of his greeting disgusted me. I refused the proffered handshake and looked him straight in the eyes. I told him, "Mr. Poppins, your game is up. You are a faker and an impostor, and you have told Miss Rossica things about me that are not true. I am here to expose you before you have succeeded in your blackmailing schemes." Popkin's smile became even more broad, and turning to Rossica, he exclaimed in Magyar so rapidly that I could not understand all of what he said to her. "You see, he knows me. This is the great spiritualist whom we were talking, who used to be my pupil." "You are lying to that girl," I exclaimed in English, my temper showing in my face. Well, my dear Mr. Houdini," he replied in English, rubbing his hands together, "we shall talk this over at our leisure. If you will allow me, I should like to talk this little matter over with you alone in another room. It will be to your advantage," he added, a menacing glint in his eyes belying the broadness of his smile. "No, I will talk right now, in Magyar, before these two women," I said, and turned to Rossica. Popkins stood for just a minute until I had launched into my explanation. Then suddenly he leaped upon my back and threw his arms around my head, trying to bend it back and choke me. I was taken off my guard by the suddenness of the attack, and went down in a heap. I quickly shook my assailant from my shoulders, and with a smashing blow to the chin I sent him reeling to the wall. Unfortunately, he was not alone, for from the window he had seen the arrival of his accomplices from the Hermannstadt before he leaped upon me. He raised his voice to a shrill, terrified scream, and his confederates rushed into the room and were upon me. There were 4 men instead of the 2 that were expected. I was quickly trussed and thrown to one corner of the room, where one of the men sat guarding over me with a drawn revolver to prevent me from undoing my bonds and escaping. The 2 servants of the castle had come in alarm at hearing the noise of the combat. They were quickly overcome and tied into chairs. Then the accomplices, under the direction of Popkins, from whose face the grin had faded, calmly proceeded to tie the hands of the Countess and Rossica, who had shrunk terrified to the corner of the room. I was as much surprised as anyone at the sudden turn events had taken. When I had acceded to the request of the Countess, I had expected merely a stormy scene when I denounced the medium from Hermannstadt to prevent him from wresting the secret that would enable him to blackmail the family out of all its possessions. But now I found myself the prisoner of 5 desperate men in a Hungarian castle, and these men bore me a deep and serious grudge for spoiling their game. If they killed me, my friends would never know what had happened to me. Certainly Popkins had reason to hate me. The 2 witnesses who had come from Hermannstadt to witness Rossica's document had of course been summoned by Popkins, and not by spirits. He had arranged with them before he left Hermannstadt, and knew the very hour they were expected at Castle D. His object in perpetrating this hoax on Rossica was obvious. He wanted her to believe that the spirit message from her mother was authentic. And how better could he accomplish this than by having the spirit of the dead woman announce that the witnesses were coming, and then having their arrival prove the truth of the message. So Popkins cleverly had the apparition say that the witnesses were actually on their way. The 2 men had brought with them 2 others in the guise of servants in case of emergency. As there was no longer any reason for them to retain this assumed position, they now appeared in their true light as accomplices of Popkins. This I gathered from the conversation, although my knowledge of the Magyar tongue was not sufficient to enable me to understand all that was said. It became quickly evident that they were intent upon forcing Rossica to write the blackmailing document at once, by any means within their power. To my intense indignation, Popkins stepped toward the girl and slapped her face. This was a bad blunder, for it set the stubborn spirit of the girl against any compromise with this gang of blackmailing desperados who had made her the dupe of their pretended mediumistic powers. The woman servant screamed loudly, and one of the men gagged her with the scarf from the back of the chair in which she was bound, although her screams would prove unavailing in any case, since the aged caretaker of the castle grounds was the only person within the range of her voice, and he was deaf. I relieved my feelings by a stream of rather vigorous English, telling Popkins what I thought of a man who would strike a bound and defenseless woman. He grinned maliciously, and coming over to the corner where I lay, he deliberately kicked me in the pit of the stomach. By this time I had freed myself from my bonds and sprang upon Popkins. The man with the revolver did not dare to fire for fear of hitting Popkins, but he managed to bring down the butt of his revolver with crushing force upon my head. I was dazed for a minute and crumpled to the floor. The man tightly bound me again, and Popkins produced from a black handbag a pair of strong handcuffs, which he locked around my wrists so tightly that they cut into the flesh. "Mr. Handcuff King," he said to me in English, "we will see what you can do with these pretty bracelets on your wrists. You have publicly challenged anyone in Hungary to shackle you with handcuffs that you cannot pick. These, my dear sir, are not special make, but I fear you will not get out of them as easily as you slipped out of the German police handcuffs in the jury room at Cologne. Oh, yes, I know all about that. Your reputation has preceded you in Hungary." Then in Magyar he ordered one of his accomplices to bring a hammer and nail. While these were being looked for, the two servants were removed and carried to another room. Popkins, meanwhile, was carving a lead pencil into long strips. When the hammer was brought, he smashed the locks of the handcuffs by driving the iron nail into them, and then withdrawing the nail, he drove the pieces of the lead pencil into the lock, plugging it tightly. Leaving the Countess and her sister tied to the table, the 5 men dragged me out into the hallway, where Popkins proceeded to rip off my clothes with a sharp knife until I was stark naked. He then searched my hair for concealed keys and lockpicks. "I am merely playing fair with myself, Mr. Houdini," said Popkins with the most malignant grin I have ever beheld. "I am not giving you a chance to open locks with any files or saws or picks that you may have concealed in your clothes. So you will have to excuse me if I remove your garments. I am going to introduce you to the inside of a dungeon of which even the Countess does not know the existence. I've gone too far now to stick at putting you out of the way. But I am not going to murder you, Mr. Houdini. You will simply die of starvation, and if ever you are found, it will be years after we are gone from here, and only your bones will remain to tell the world that this was Houdini." I struggled until I was exhausted, but my captors tied my ankles together with coarse wire, blindfolded me, and then carried me through seemingly endless passages down a winding and damp stairway to a musty recess at the bottom of a dungeon. Here I was dropped through a hole in the dungeon floor into a muddy cavern, and Popkins jumped down after me. Around my arms, which were already tightly handcuffed behind me, he passed a double pair of fetters that were riveted to the castle wall behind me. Then the bandage was removed from my eyes. I lay naked on the muddy floor of the blackest, most evil-smelling cavern that it has ever been my lot to see in years of traveling in foreign countries. It was what is called an oubliette, a dark hole where prisoners are thrown and forgotten by the world until their skeletons are found years later. I was not the first occupant of that dismal cavern, for Popkins had removed from the fetters a partially closed skeleton before he clasped the gyves upon my arms. I looked at this grisly object, lying in the mud beside me, as Popkins' lantern threw its weak rays around that terrible place, and I shuddered. Bits of moldy clothing still clung to the bones and the skull, which had fallen off as Popkins' accomplices threw the skeleton to one side, stared at me out of eyeless sockets as if grimacing in the unholy glee at finding a companion after all these years. I judged from the appearance of bits of clothing that the skeleton was that of a girl, and indeed some of her long hair was sticking to the wall behind me. I could feel it against the back of my neck. Popkins kicked me in the ribs, and then climbed out of the dismal hole, assisted by one of his accomplices who let a rope down to him. I was left in complete and terrible darkness. Not even the Countess knew of the existence of the oubliette, Popkins had said. It must have been reached then through a secret passage, possibly through a hidden door. How then did Popkins know the passage that led to it, or even know of its existence? I remembered that the Countess recognized him as someone she had once seen at the castle in years gone by, although she could not say when or under what circumstances. Truly the man had a sinister history. His connection with the castle, and possibly with the dissolute old Count, must have been far closer than the Countess suspected. I have been in many difficult situations, but never did my prospects seem so dismal as at that moment. I have suffered worse physical tortures at Blackburn, England, where I was manacled and trussed in iron by a strong man on the stage of the Palace Theatre, on October 24th, 1902, and suffered brutality until my arms and wrists were torn and bleeding from the irons, of which the locks had been plugged in violation of the rules of fair play, even as they were plugged by Popkins in this instance. But in that instance, I could have released myself from my tortures at any minute if I had merely admitted myself beaten, instead of continuing my struggle with the irons until I finally freed myself by my own efforts. But now there seemed no way out of my tortures as I lay naked in the mud of the oubliette, fettered to the wall, under the bed of the Meros River, in a musty cavern through the walls of which the nitre was seeping. Release from the fetters of the oubliette was not as difficult as I had feared, but my plugged handcuffs held my wrist rigidly, and the flesh was swelling beneath the cruel bite of the steel, making it doubly difficult to extricate myself. However, having released my arms from the wall, I felt more comfortable, and was enabled to disentangle my ankles from the wire that bound them. I could not climb out of the oubliette with my hands shackled behind me, but I resorted to an old trick. I bent forward and doubled my legs until I was able to loop my fettered arms around my feet and bring my hands still shackled in front of me. Then fell to me a grisly task, which I think I would not care to repeat for the combined fortunes of Rockefeller and Henry Ford. My captors, after all their precautions to remove all clothing and everything that might serve to pick a lock, had overlooked the human skeleton that lay beside me in the oubliette. I knelt on the skeleton and splintered the ribs. Indeed, it was with a bone broken from the skeleton by my feet that I was able to open the gyves that fettered me to the wall. And this was not so difficult as might be supposed, after I had solved the problem of how to get hold of the bone and manipulate it. This required a good deal of contortionistic skill, but was easy as compared with the task of opening the locks of the handcuffs that had been plugged with wood and mashed with a nail. In my long and adventurous career I have never failed to open a lock, but this was not a legitimate test, any more than the test on the stage at Blackburn was legitimate. I had succeeded there, but it seemed as if I was facing utter failure here. I got the wooden plugging out of one of the cuffs when the fear seized me that the false spiritualist might return to murder me. Popkins, as I had learned from his remark about my escape from handcuffs at Cologne, knew that I had opened the best locks of the German police, and he might conceivably be struck with the possibility that I could escape also from his manacles, plugged though they were. I climbed out of the oubliette into the dungeon above it, unlocked the massive door of the dungeon, which was easy work as compared to opening some of the locks in American jails, and stepped out into a damp passageway. A ray of light wavered along the passageway, and I sprang back into the dungeon just in time to avoid discovery. I nearly fell back into the oubliette in my haste. True enough, they had sent a man back to put an end to me. He raised his lantern, and threw its rays through the barred square in the upper part of the massive dungeon door. I crouched directly beneath the opening, and he failed to see me. I heard him fumble with the lock, and he opened the door hesitatingly, surprised to find that the key turned so easily. His back was toward me as he set down the lantern. In his right hand he held a revolver with which he evidently intended to shoot me. I sprang upon his back, looping my handcuffed arms over his head, and bent his head back. Although my wrists were manacled, I had the advantage which attaches to surprise. I got him under me, and pressed my knee into his throat. I was choking him into insensibility when part of the dungeon floor gave way, precipitating him head first into the oubliette, out of which I had climbed a minute before. The lantern crashed into the opening and went out, leaving us both in darkness. I groped my way into the passage, feeling my way up step by step, for I feared hidden holes and trapdoors that might drop me into the Meros River. I ascended a long, winding stairway and finally saw a dim light ahead of me, and came out into a gloomy corridor in the upper part of the castle. True enough, the dungeons were reached by a hidden panel, which had been left open by the man who had just gone down to kill me. I closed it, and admired the absolute skill with which it was concealed. but the Countess and her sister Rossica were in the power of Popkins and his unscrupulous companions, who were perhaps torturing them into giving them the document that the blackmailers wanted, and my own position was precarious, so I had little time to admire the skill of construction of that panel. I must get away, remove my manacles, get some clothes, and summon help. I climbed out of a window in the castle tower and began to descend the wall in the fading twilight, manacled though I was. Then I remembered that in my eagerness to reach safety, I had neglected to lock the door into the dungeon above the oubliette. This was the mistake that nearly cost me my life. This remarkable adventure of Houdini will be concluded in the next issue of Weird Tales. End of Section 1. Section 2 of Weird Tales presents The Strange World of Harry Houdini. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Excerpt from The Eyrie, Weird Tales, March 1924. By editor Edwin Baird. Ask Houdini. Houdini, master of escape authority on the subject of spiritualistic and psychic phenomena and creator of the weird and mysterious, will answer through the columns of this magazine any rational question that is deemed of general interest to our readers. No attention will be paid to questions regarding the solution of feats generally performed by Houdini, but he will attempt to offer a scientific and logical explanation of any phenomena you may have witnessed or encountered in your private life. Questions dealing with spiritualistic phenomena will be carefully answered provided they are of general interest. No questions regarding public performances of magic, hypnotism, etc. will be answered, and no attention will be paid to communications without the name and address of the writer. All letters will be treated with strict confidence, and will not appear in print with the name of the writer unless desired. All correspondence should be typewritten, if possible, and be addressed to Houdini, care of Weird Tales, 854 North Clark Street, Chicago. The name Houdini has long been synonymous throughout the world with such words as uncanny and supernatural. Indeed, so widely known is Houdini's name that it appears in this connection in Funk and Wagnall's dictionary. Houdini emphatically does not believe in occult superstitions, and he probably would deny just as vigorously that his miraculous escapes from prison cells and handcuffs are aided by disembodied spirits, as so many believe they are. And yet there is no denying that many of his amazing exploits smack of the supernatural. No wonder his name is associated with things that cannot be explained. His strange adventures in the far corners of the world are as hair-raising, as uncanny, and as deeply absorbing as the fiction we have published in Weird Tales. Wherefore, mindful of what our readers like, we propose to Houdini that he select from his vast store of experiences a particularly thrilling adventure, and tell our readers about it. He acquiesced, and the first installment of his extraordinary article appears in this issue of Weird Tales. You probably have read it before turning back here to read the Eyrie, and we think you will agree with us that it's one of the most interesting things we've ever published. Unless we're grievously mistaken, you will like the second and final installment still better. Terrifying to say the least, were Houdini's adventures in that underground torture chamber. But more terrifying still are the things that follow. In the April issue of Weird Tales, the Houdini article will be concluded, and we can promise you that you'll feel well repaid for having read the rest of it. We recommend that you order the April issue early. Tell your news dealer to save a copy for you. There is likely to be an unprecedented demand for it, and you will feel chagrined if the salesman says in response to your belated request, "We're all out of April Weird Tales." We also suggest that you miss none of our forthcoming issues. This Houdini article, remember, is only the first of a series. More will follow. Watch for them. End of Section 2. Section 3 of Weird Tales presents The Strange World of Harry Houdini. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Spirit Fakers of Hermannstadt, Part 2. After finishing a theatrical engagement at Rohnacher's establishment at Vienna, Houdini, master of escape, takes a jaunt through the Maros Valley. He is approached by the Countess D, who has fallen in the hands of some unprincipled blackmailers headed by the notorious Popkins, a self-styled spiritualistic medium. Popkins has been endeavoring to secure from the Countess D and her sister Rossica a written confession of their dead father's misdeeds, intending to later use this confession against them. Houdini is persuaded to accompany the Countess D to the castle, where he temporarily falls into the hands of Popkins and his comrades. He is shackled and thrown into a secret dungeon of the castle, where he escapes by methods known only to himself, at which point you take up the narrative. Descending the side of Castle D with my hands manacled in front of me was rather a ticklish business. But owing to the shape of the stones, there were many crevices into which I could dig my fingers, and the wall was rough enough to provide support for my bare feet. I would have made my escape without great difficulty, except for my hasty oversight in not locking the door to the dungeon when I left it after having thrown my assailant into the oubliette. The man managed to make his way out, and he recovered his revolver, which had either been precipitated into the oubliette with him, or else was lying on the floor of the dungeon in which I had fought him. I went slowly down the wall of the Castle D to within 20 feet of the river, when he made his appearance at the window of the tower above me, revolver in hand. He fired 2 shots at me, but fortunately he was too excited to aim accurately. I half dived, half fell into the Maros River. The water could not have been more than 6 or 7 feet deep where I dived, for my head came in contact with the bed of the river, and I came near being stuck in the soft mud. I struck out underwater for the opposite shore, for my only hope lay in getting away from accurate range of the man's weapon. Swimming with the hands manacled is not as difficult as might be imagined. Those who have seen my motion picture Terror Island, in which I have to enter a ship through a door in the bottom, will realize that I am a strong swimmer and my skill stood me in good stead now. A lump of warm lead deflected by the river touched me gently on the shoulder and sank heavily past me. I realized that the scoundrel in the castle window was still shooting at me, and I wondered whether he could see me from his position above the river, as I swam underwater as close to the river bottom as I could. Forced at last to come up for air, I found that I was well past the middle of the river, and that the water was shallow enough to stand. I showed hardly more than my nose above the surface, however, for I did not care to reveal myself as a target for flying bullets, even though the dusk was deepening every minute. I took a deep breath and continued my progress along the bottom. I finally pulled myself out in the shadow of some bushes that grew on the bank. Peering through these, I saw 2 faces at the window through which I had escaped a few minutes before. My assailant had been joined by another of the gang, who doubtless had hurried to his aid after hearing the shots. Another report rang out, and a bullet hit the water under the castle close where I had dived. My foes had not seen me then as I swam across the river, for they believed I was where I had fallen in. This conjecture was confirmed a minute or so later when another of the gang came to the water's edge. He peered along the buttress to see if he could discover my body lying on the bottom. He also fired 1 shot into the water near where I had gone into the stream. Cupping his lips, he shouted up to the 2 scoundrels in the window and then began peering very carefully into the river, walking downstream for 100 yards in an attempt to locate my body. Coming back to the buttress, he again searched the water carefully, looking upstream toward the spot where I had fallen in. He again cupped his lips and shouted back to his fellow conspirators. They shouted back to him to remain on guard and keep up the search. Then they left the window. The darkness grew thicker, and I worked to free myself from the handcuffs. I had picked out the wooden plugging from one of the locks before I left the oubliette, but the other was more difficult, for the plugging had swollen as a result of its bath in the river. However, I soon had both hands free, and I chafed my wrists to restore the circulation, for they had been cruelly lacerated by the close bite of the steel. How I unlocked the handcuffs is, of course, my own secret. Even though the locks were mashed, I found them less difficult to remove than the German police handcuffs at Cologne during the trial of my suit against the police official who had slandered me by publicly proclaiming me a charlatan. At Cologne I was stripped and fastened by a pair of expertly made links, which, on the testimony of the locksmith who made them, could not be opened even by the key that locked them. The handcuffs that Popkins had clamped so tightly on my wrists, however, were ordinary police manacles, and I was thoroughly familiar with their construction, for I have made locks my special study for many years. This particular cuff was made in Sheffield, England, and was one in general use throughout the continent. It is a clumsy cuff, and can be jarred open by a quick glancing blow on the open side of the manacle. This causes the spring to snap back, which in turn pulls back the small bolt. But my wrists were bleeding and my whole body ached from the brutal treatment I had endured at the hands of the gang from Hermannstadt. My first thought was to summon help. With this in mind, I clambered through the bushes and struck out haphazard in the general direction of the village I had left. Then I thought of Rossica and the Countess D, and the devils in human form in whose power they were held at that moment, and I resolved upon the dangerous plan of returning to Castle D to their aid. If I had coolly weighed the chances against me, I probably never would have considered such a foolhardy line of conduct as returning to the castle. The men there were my foes. They were well armed and desperate. I was unarmed and naked, yet after all I had the advantage which attaches to surprise. The 5 men from Hermannstadt believed me dead. The obvious, sensible thing to do was to find a peasant and summon aid at once, but at the moment this seemed like a tremendous waste of time, for the blackmailers had Rossica and the Countess in their power, and were perhaps even now torturing them into revealing the dead secrets babbled by their father in his dying delirium. So I determined to take advantage of the darkness and return. I could no longer see the sentinel on the opposite bank, but I did not doubt that he was there. Taking the handcuffs with me, I warily slipped into the Maros River and swam noiselessly to the opposite bank. I crawled out cautiously and retreated into the shadows. Pretty soon I heard the sentinel coming slowly toward me. Straining my eyes to see him as well as possible, I crouched to spring. He must have seen my white body move in the darkness, for he uttered an exclamation, and his hand was on the trigger of his revolver as I knocked it from his grasp. He was completely taken by surprise and offered amazingly little resistance. I took his outer garments from him and handcuffed him with the steel bracelets that Popkins had used on me. He made no outcry, and I gagged him to prevent his giving an alarm. With strips torn from his own undergarments, I then tied him to a stout shrub and proceeded to clothe myself in his trousers and blouse. I even tried on his shoes, but they were much too big for me. I reflected that it would be easier to climb the castle with bare feet than with shoes on, in any event. So I contented myself with the man's outer garments, and turned my attention to entering the castle. I suppose I could have entered boldly through one of the doors without being detected, but the risk of meeting someone seemed too great. I had found on my descent that the rough wall of the castle was very easy to climb, so I decided to enter by the human fly method. I scaled the wall and made my entrance through one of the windows in the 2nd story. I stood noiselessly in the darkness for a minute, and then began to feel my way toward that part of the building in which the spirit fakers from Hermannstadt had confined Rossica and the Countess D. The door into the corridor was locked, for I had come into one of the rooms that was no longer used, but I unlocked it with much greater ease than many American jail locks, for it was old, very simply constructed, and yielded readily to my knowledge. As I passed noiselessly down the corridor, I heard a low moaning from one of the rooms. The door was closed but not locked, and I stealthily entered. It was the room into which the old servants, the man and his wife, who looked after the upkeep of the castle and cooked the meals, had been thrown by Popkins and his co-conspirators. The ruffians had not even gagged them, for there was nobody within hearing distance beside themselves and the deaf caretaker of the grounds when they were thrown into the room. It was the woman who was moaning. She was lying face down on the floor, tied to a bedpost, and her position was painfully uncomfortable. In addition, she was badly frightened, for she expected no mercy from men so brutal that they would strike a girl like Rossica and offer such indignities to the Countess. I released them both and sent the man post-haste in search of help. I was afraid to let the old woman go with him, for fear he would not return, once they had left the dreaded castle behind them. So I told her to remain in the room. I cautioned her husband to make no noise as he went out, and together we stole like 2 cats through the dark corridors and out into the night. I grasped his hand, whispered in Magyar a command to return with all possible speed as soon as he got a sufficient number of men together to effect a rescue, and then I returned to the castle. I heard a weird voice sounding like a woman's voice, coming from the large room where Rossica and the Countess had been tied up. I listened at the door for several minutes, but I could make nothing of the sound. No light came from beneath the door, and I judged that the room was in darkness. Still, that uncanny voice droned on in Magyar. I could not distinguish many words, for the voice came to me very faintly through the door. My curiosity and my anxiety at length got the better of my fears, and I noiselessly, stealthily opened the door. A luminous ring was moving in weird spirals high in the air. The voice had ceased momentarily, but soon the luminous ring ceased its spiraling and remained stationary, and the voice spoke again softly with a peculiar wailing intonation. I was puzzled to know what was happening. Then the truth flashed upon me, and I was amazed at the utter audacity of Popkins. Having failed in his attempts to extort from Rossica the secrets of her dead father, he had the effrontery to resort once more to a spiritualistic seance in an effort to break down her resistance before attempting to apply torture. No other sound was heard except the breathing of the four men and a smothered exclamation from time to time from one or the other of the two women, who had been placed at one end of the table, as I found out afterward, and bound into their chairs. The voice droned on, and I soon realized that Popkins was trying to make Rossica think that it was her mother's voice commanding her to reveal the secrets. The seance, after all that had happened, could hardly be expected to convince anyone, especially Rossica, for she knew now that the men were unscrupulous charlatans. The plan was unworthy of so clever a man as Popkins, for now that Rossica had seen the men from Hermannstadt were in reality his accomplices, and other happenings had dashed her faith in him, she could hardly believe in the reality of any spirit voices that he might produce. But Popkins, the charlatan, confident of his own powers to deceive and knowing full well that he could imitate to perfection the voices of the girl's parents, still thought he could work on Rossica's credulity through a seance, despite all that had occurred to undeceive her. I listened for a while to the voice. The language was of course Magyar, but as the voice spoke very slowly, I had very little difficulty in understanding it. Despite the weird, sepulchral quality of the tone, which the medium obtained by holding rolled-up paper in his mouth while he was speaking, the voice must have borne a distinct resemblance to the living voice of Rossica's mother, for presently the girl started weeping, and little choking sobs joined the sepulchral voice in a weird duet. The voice told Rossica that her father was undergoing terrible torments because of the sins he had committed while in the body. In any case, it said, the torments would continue for many long years, for the man had sinned grievously. But since no one was utterly beyond redemption, Rossica had the chance to assist her father to a possible future atonement, and end his sufferings. She was to write out the terrible confessions of her father, made in his delirium, and sign it in the presence of the men who had come from Hermannstadt, so that they could witness the signature. It would not be necessary to read it to them, but she must show the confession to Popkins. Then she should take the paper alone into the black dungeon and conceal it behind a certain stone in the wall, which the voice described in detail. This stone was loose and could easily be pried out with a knife. She should replace the stone and say nothing to anyone about what she had done. Popkins said the voice was very evil, and she was loath to let him know the confession. But there was no other way in which the evil Count D could be offered the chance to expiate his crimes. And furthermore, a spell had been put upon Popkins that would make him powerless to make known to anyone the contents of the document. She had been obliged to use Popkins as a medium, because the spirit of Count D could not get into rapport with a medium of more refined psychic fiber. But the spirit of the Countess would lend Rossica her aid. The document could not be used by Popkins in any case, the voice explained, because it would be hidden in the black dungeon, and his mere knowledge of its contents could not harm Rossica or her sister unless Popkins could prove his statements. The other four from Hermannstadt would witness merely the signature, and would not read the contents of the document. Then perhaps centuries later, someone would discover the paper, and with this earthly revelation of the old Count's crimes, a chance would be given his spirit to make expiation. I was more and more amazed as the seance proceeded. Popkins evidently thought he could convince Rossica that the spirit voice was genuine by branding himself as evil. for Rossica now knew that he was evil, and might take the frank admission of this fact as a sign of the truth of the seance. Truly Popkins had found the girl so easy to dupe in earlier seances that he overestimated her gullibility. I stole cautiously around the group, a shadow among shadows of that great room. I stopped directly behind the false medium. As long as the men were not actually torturing the women, I thought it best to allow the seance to continue, and thus allow time for the reinforcements to arrive. But now the voice trailed off indistinctly and died away in a soft whisper. The luminous ring, which was nothing more nor less than a phosphorescent ring painted on the wide mouth of a long-speaking trumpet, again began describing its weird spirals in the air over the heads of the sitters. Popkins stirred uneasily, although he was supposed to be in a trance. He was manipulating the speaking trumpet, which is part of the stock in trade of every medium, when I suddenly seized the hand that held it and closed my left hand over his windpipe. I knew the signs. I knew that the seance was about over. A lamp would be lighted, I would be discovered in the room, the two women would be tortured, since the seance had failed to convince them, and the men would either kidnap them or extort the document from them before help could arrive. Help might already be close at hand, or it might not come for hours. My own position would become precarious in any case, for the men would undoubtedly murder me out of hand. There was nothing for it except to prolong the seance. Since the medium was about to come out of his supposed trance and bring the sitting to an end, I resolved to take his place and continue the seance. My grip was like steel at his throat. He could not cry out, nor could he release his right hand from the powerful hold I had obtained on it. He clawed frantically at the hand that was shutting off his wind, and a strange bubbling gurgle came from his throat. This alarmed me, but needlessly. "He is coming out of his trance," whispered one of the men to Rossica, for so he interpreted the sound that he had heard. Popkins slumped into an unconscious heap. I stuffed his own handkerchief into his mouth as a gag, and slit his blouse with his own knife silently to obtain strips wherewith to bind him. This I did silently while the sitters were waiting for him to utter the groan that should show the spirit control had left him and he had recovered consciousness. I had attended many seances. I knew the procedure well. I trussed up his legs so that he could not kick or make any other noise with his feet when he came to, and took the medium's place at the head of the table. Straightway the luminous circle again began to weave its loops and spirals over the heads of the sitters, but it was I who manipulated the trumpet, and not Popkins. He lay behind me in a trance that was much more real than any he had ever undergone during his seances. I had withdrawn from his pocket, while searching for his knife, several wads of paper already rolled, and I stuck some of this in my mouth to give my voice a sepulchral sound. In my case, this procedure was really necessary, for if I had spoken in a natural voice, the American accent with which I spoke Magyar would have betrayed me. But with paper in my mouth and my voice further disguised by the speaking trumpet, I began to talk very slowly in broken words, as if I were the spirit of old Count D, torn with contrition and begging, pleading for a chance to expiate. I continued in this vein for 20 minutes or more when I realized that the other conspirators were getting restless. I don't think they suspected I was not Popkins, no matter how poor my Magyar accent might have been, for they could hardly dream of anything so strange as Houdini, whom they had seen drowned in the Maros River, returning to overpower the medium and take his place. But they had not expected so long a seance, and were impatient to have it over with. I sensed this impatience, and prepared to meet the inevitable discovery of my presence. Of the 5 men, 1 was bound and lying by the river's bank. Popkins was trussed up, gagged, and unconscious on the floor behind me. 3 were left to oppose me. The seance had continued for the greater part of an hour before I took Popkins' place. Help might come at any minute, but I could not count upon this, for I did not know how far the old servant had to go to summon aid. The sepulchral voice in which I was speaking trailed off into silence as Popkins' voice had done. Rossica had long since ceased sobbing, for she no longer heard her mother's voice. I rose silently and stole like a shadow to the 2 women. I cut their bonds with the knife I had taken from Popkins, and then pondered what else I could do to protect myself and the 2 girls. The thought came to me that I could overcome each of my remaining 3 assailants in the same way I had overcome Popkins, and I proceeded forthwith to grapple with one of them. But I missed my first hold in the darkness, and he uttered a frightened oath as I grabbed him. He half arose, and his chair crashed to the floor. We fell together, I on top, and I quickly had my knee at his throat. Then one of the other two men lit the lamp. I drew the revolver of the man under me and sprang to my feet. I was not quick enough, for I found myself looking into the muzzle of another revolver. "Drop the weapon!" my opponent shouted. I suddenly dropped to the floor, at the same time raising my right leg in a tremendous kick at the man's hand. He fired as I dropped, and the revolver flew out of his hand. My bare foot had landed painfully for me on the weapon, but the kick had disarmed the man. I at once covered the other man who had lighted the lamp and asked Rossica to take his weapon from him. The Countess picked up the other revolver. The man I tried to throttle arose and rushed at me, snarling like a wild beast. I was forced to shoot, and I sent a bullet into his knee. He sank to the floor with a look of pain and reached for his revolver. He was out of his head from rage and pain. Fortunately for me, his weapon was in my hand instead of his. "You see," I exclaimed in Magyar, "resistance is useless. The old servant went for help a long time ago, while I stayed here and heard your leader trying to delude the ladies into thinking it was their mother's voice they were hearing. There is your leader on the floor." I pointed to Popkins. "He is unconscious. No, he is coming to. See, he is blinking his eyes. I've been Popkins for 20 minutes, while Popkins has been lying there in a trance. It is well for you that you did not shoot me. It would mean the rope for all of you." The men glowered at me. The man on the floor sat nursing his knee and cursing very loudly. "The police have been notified," I said, "and soon there will be many strong men here to take you into custody. Now, if you please, you will let the ladies pass out of the room. It is not pleasant for them to listen to such cursing as our friend in the corner is indulging in." I waved my hand toward the man with the wounded knee. "No, by God!" howled the shorter of the two men, barring Rossica's way to the door. "They will stay here, and we will do the going out ourselves. Stand out of their way while I release Popkins." Popkins, by this time, had spit out the handkerchief that I had stuffed into his mouth, and launched out into a stream of as disgusting and filthy profanity as ever I have heard. I did not understand nearly all of it, but Rossica looked sick, and the eyes of the Countess opened wide in horror. I would not let the men untie him, and they would not let the two women pass through the door. We had reached an impasse, as they would not obey my commands despite the weapon in my hand. Then suddenly one of the men kicked the lamp over, and as it crashed to the floor, the room was plunged into darkness. Rossica uttered a shriek as one of the scoundrels wrenched the revolver from her. Several flashes of fire spit into the gloom as the man shot at me in the darkness, but the sound of many feet caused them to burst out into the hallway. They were too late, for they ran plump into the arms of a dozen peasants, who were armed with heavy clubs, pitchforks, and axes. The peasants had been summoned by the old servant, who accompanied them back to the castle. They quickly disarmed the man who had the revolver, and trussed up all three captives in the room where Popkins lay straining at his bonds. 3 of the peasants went out to the river-bank and brought in the man I had tied up. The situation was hopeless for the men from Hermannstadt, but Popkins had not yet played the last card in his game of brazen effrontery. Beaten in his efforts to obtain the document, he now sought to effect his own release and the release of his companions from the trap into which they had fallen. "I think, Countess," said Popkins, who had just been swearing so frightfully before her, "I think you had better instruct your people to unbind me and my comrades, and let us go back to Hermannstadt. There are certain secrets about your father that you might not care to have made public. And if these people knew them, they would probably chase you out of the country." Rossica turned white. I thought then by the strange set of her lips, and I still think now, that it was righteous and fierce anger rather than fear that made her blanch. I felt keenly for the poor girl in that moment, but the Countess won my heartiest admiration. She turned her dark eyes on Popkins with all the dignity of a queen. "I haven't the remotest idea what you are talking about," she said. "These people all knew my father, the Count D., and if I were you, I would not slander the memory of that great and good nobleman. I think after all that has happened, you will not find anyone who will believe you." This was a master stroke. Popkins realized how precarious his situation was and what actual physical danger he was in. Besides, he had no proofs. I saw the Countess in Hermannstadt later, after the hearing on the cases of the 5 spirit fakers. From her I learned that Popkins had formerly been an agent of the Count, her father, and it was as such that she had seen him at Castle D. Popkins was so close to the Count that he had been associated with him in his dark crimes, and he did not dare reveal them to the authorities because of his own criminal connection with them. Under duress, however, he told this story, which was as near a confession as he made. He had acted as agent for the Count in a large number of promotional schemes backed by the Count's money, but in which the Count's name did not appear. The Count had cheated him out of all his share of the earnings, and threatened to expose him as the active agent in a number of mysterious robberies, in which the Count, to protect himself, had manufactured evidence pointing toward Popkins as the perpetrator. Popkins had known of the oubliette and the Black Dungeon during his association in the dark deeds of the Count, and he knew the mysteries of the castle as well as the Count himself. He had returned to Castle D to demand a final accounting from the Count by the threats of exposing his infamies, and made his way to the Count's room only to find him dying. The two girls were in the bedroom, and Popkins listened outside the door to the remorseful man's delirium. That was how he knew that the two girls were in possession of the Count's secrets. He had become a spiritualist charlatan thereafter, having dabbled in black magic and deceptive tricks, and one day when the Count's daughter Rossica attended one of his seances in Hermannstadt, he conceived the bold plan of getting her by trickery to write down the confessions made by the Count in his dying delirium. He knew the Black Dungeon, and he planned to steal the document after Rossica had placed it behind the stone, and then he could blackmail them out of all they possessed in return for restoring the document to them. Thus he would revenge himself upon the Count's descendants and become master of their estates. Popkins was convicted of conspiracy, attempted murder, and kidnapping, and he and his companions were given long prison terms. Among his disciples in Hermannstadt was a Russian named Illusionist, who left Hermannstadt and made his way back to Russia before the authorities could apprehend him. I have reason to believe that Illusionist was in reality the false monk Eliodor, known as Rasputin, who became the most sinister figure in Russian history. It will be recalled that Eliodor, or Rasputin, witnessing the feats of black magic performed in the Tsar's court by Irving Bishop, told the Tsarina that he could do much more marvelous things. And from that time he gradually gained an ascendancy over the Tsarina, and later the Tsar, that made him the real ruler of Russia. Never was any other ruler so profligate and wicked as Rasputin, the evil force behind the throne of Tsar Nicholas II. Countess D. thanked me for all I had done for her, and told me she had but one regret in the whole matter. What was that? I asked.
Do you remember, she replied, that when Popkins tried to threaten me before my peasants, I told him my father was a great and good nobleman whom I would not allow him to slander? It is the memory of that lie that hurts. If it were to be done over again, I do not think I could say a good word for my father. Even if life itself were at stake, I ask only that he be forgotten. Mr. Houdini, you and I and Rossica and that devil Popkins are the only persons in the world who really know what my father was. You can sympathize with my feelings.
The end. End of Section 3. Section 4 of Weird Tales presents The Strange World of Harry Houdini. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Ask Houdini. Weird Tales Magazine, April 1924. This department is open to all readers of Weird Tales who have some questions to propound. Houdini will attempt to answer any logical question on subjects relating to physical or psychic phenomena. Readers are requested not to duplicate questions that have already been answered by Houdini in these columns. Footnote. Hundreds of letters have been received by Houdini since the announcement of this department in the March issue. Time does not permit taking up as many of these as desired on account of the rush to get the April issue on sale in time. This department bids fair to become an interesting feature of Weird Tales, and the publishers assure you that sufficient space will be allotted it to cover all worthwhile subjects. Questions pertaining to the future and personalities will receive no attention. They must have a general interest, otherwise they will not be considered. All correspondence will be handled by Houdini personally, and he is especially interested in hearing from those having unique experiences not easily explained. the publishers. Forward. Ingrained in me is a love of mystery and marvel. As a child, Red Riding Hood, Ali Baba, and the Arabian Nights found as much favor with me as the stories from the Bible. All were read to me by my mother. Stories of the weird and wonderful exercise a surpassing charm over my imagination. I feel there are many thousands like me, and from these I will be delighted to hear. Who knows but that this department may be the means of bringing to light another Poe or another Hawthorne? Only by writing can you learn to write. By throwing off restraint, the greatest pieces of literature have been produced. This department is yours as much as mine. Houdini. Number 1. Terre Haute, Indiana. Houdini, courtesy of Weird Tales, Chicago, Illinois. Dear Sir, years ago there traveled round the country a man named Samri S. Baldwin, known as the White Mahatma. Could you tell me if he is still living, and if so, where a letter could reach him? Were there any other White Mahatmas that did the same kind of work? Yours very truly, H.L. Answer to number 1. There were a number of White Mahatmas, all imitating Samri S. Baldwin, who is still alive and now resides in San Francisco, California. A letter addressed to the Golden Gate Assembly of the Society of American Magicians, care of Tiffin Studio, will reach him. Detroit, Michigan. Houdini, courtesy of Weird Tales, Chicago, Illinois. Dear Sir, I have just finished reading your expose of spiritualism in the March issue of Weird Tales, and can assure you that I am very anxious to read the next installment. I was born in a section of England where it is the custom for those who wish to sink a well to employ the services of a dowser. A dowser is a person who travels around with a forked twig, jamming it in the ground, and when this twig moves, turning suddenly in his hand, he states that water will be found below. Experience shows that in this practice he is usually, though not invariably, correct. Now these dowsers are not as a rule scientific or learned men, nor have they any special local knowledge. Very often indeed they are merely laborers. Sometimes this man dispenses with the use of the dowser, being able to tell by his own sensation that he is over water. So common is this custom in this part of England I refer to, and so great is the belief in these dowsers, that few people indeed would think of sinking a well without the aid of one of these men. Many explanations have been offered of this practice, and I am anxious to hear your opinion regarding the same. It is very true that in sticking this twig in the ground, it will move at times, just as if it were alive, in this particular section of the country where I come from. But a large percentage of people are great believers in spiritualism, and people who have faith in this sort of phenomenon insist that it is a spirit manifestation. Thanking you for any attention you may give this. Yours very truly, J.H. Answer to number 2. This is not new. In fact, it is centuries old, and you will find any number of books in your library regarding same. The fact remains that these dowsers or water diviners were not always accurate, and in view of this infallibility it is unwise to believe that they were capable of locating water or metals. The Psychical Research Society have gone thoroughly into this case of humans, and I would advise you to look up their literature on this subject. Peoria, Illinois. Houdini, courtesy of Weird Tales, Chicago, Illinois. Dear Sir, some time ago I attended a seance in this town at which quite a few people were present, and the manifestations were really wonderful. I went there purporting to be an ardent believer in spiritualism, and was well received, and was made the object of quite a little attention by the medium. Now, as a matter of fact, I am an out-and-out skeptic, but confess I do not know how to explain some of the phenomena I have witnessed. During one of the sittings or seances, the medium sat directly in front of me, held both of my hands in her right hand, and placed her other hand on my shoulder. Then I could see by glancing upward a trumpet moving around the room, then a guitar, and then a mandolin. This instrument would float over the heads of the sitters, and I have never been able to discern how this was accomplished. Can you explain? Yours very truly, H.W. Answer to number 3. There are several ways of the medium getting one hand free when you are supposed to hold both. It is one of the best-known ruses used by fraud mediums. In order to guard yourself in the future, when you go into a seance room, insist on holding the medium's hand in your own. You do the holding, and do not allow the medium to hold you. See that there is no confederate to produce the manifestations, which is frequently done. Springfield, Illinois. Houdini, courtesy of Weird Tales, Chicago, Illinois. Dear Sir, you are answering all questions on spiritualism. Do you consider yourself a human encyclopedia on the subject? I know you will not dare to answer this. How do you explain Jacoby, who in his autobiography said he saw a number of musicians in his room and they played until early morning. Jacoby was a brilliant man and a gifted scholar. How can you, at the present time, explain how this happened? I do not think you would care to answer this question, but am sending it to relieve my mind. Yours truly, H.W. Answer to number 4. No, I do not consider myself a human encyclopedia, but I have been delving in mystery ever since I could walk and talk, and if there is anything in the line of mystery I do not know, I certainly am going to try and find out. Anytime you see me build anywhere, drop around and have a chat. I am not prejudiced. As I keep telling people, I am perfectly willing to believe, but I have not been convinced or converted as yet. Jacoby did write that he saw and heard musicians in his room. He called in his servants, if you remember the incident, but they were unable to see them. After I am suspended from the top of a building by my ankles and make my escape from the restraint and come down to earth, the whole population in the houses whirl about me, but that does not signify it is true. Therefore I claim that he might have thought he had seen the musicians and heard them, but that does not necessarily make it true, although in his own mind it was true. You go to any insane asylum where you are permitted to go by the authorities, and you will find a lot of poor mortals who hear voices and see forms. I think that Jacoby simply had hallucinations at the time this happened, and that is all there is to it. Number 5, Louisville, Kentucky. Houdini, courtesy of Weird Tales, Chicago, Illinois. Dear Mr. Houdini, I'm glad to see that you are writing for Weird Tales, as it is my favorite magazine, and I am sure many other readers will bear this same opinion. In this city, which is a hotbed for spiritualism, you are confronted by believers and non-believers at every turn. I have attended many seances and probably never get a kick out of any, on account of my pronounced views against this sort of stuff. I have been told because of the fact that I am a non-believer, I will never be visited by any real manifestation. The only thing I could never understand is why do all mediums employ various paraphernalia in conducting their seances? For instance, why is it necessary for the departed one to speak through the medium with the aid of a trumpet or horn? If there is such a thing as communication with the dead, can you advance a logical explanation of why a trumpet or horn should be used? Yours very truly, H.M. Answer to number 5. The aid of trumpets, tambourines, and musical instruments used in seances, to the best of my knowledge and belief, is simply to give oracular proof that the spirits are present, and in speaking through a trumpet it is the simplest thing in the world to muffle your voice and make it difficult to recognize. At one seance which I attended in New York, I distinctly detected the odor of the departed spirit, the medium having indulged in the brand of spirits which are prohibited. I have known mediums who could talk through trumpets almost any time or place, depending upon how they were seated at the seance. I did one seance with Mrs. Reith, the celebrated Detroit trumpet medium. Dr. Wallace, being friendly with both of us, made an appointment, not telling her my name. This was in London. It was very difficult to get a seance, and when I did, I went in unannounced, but after an hour the seance was blank. As I left, she merely said, "I am sorry, Mr. Houdini, that we could get no results." I was startled. She said, "You did not think I knew you, but we traveled together on the Mauretania. So, you see, had Mrs. Wraith not recognized me, we might have had results." She evidently was afraid of taking a chance with me. Number 6, Buffalo, New York. Mr. Houdini, courtesy of Weird Tales, Chicago, Illinois. Dear Mr. Houdini, I attended a spiritualistic seance recently, presided over by a lady medium. There were some 50-odd people in the audience. Slips of paper were passed around with a request that each one write on the slip of paper and ask a question that he desired to be answered. We were requested to fold the paper with the writing inside. The questions were collected and placed on a table, the medium paying no attention to them whatsoever. The medium then invited someone to blindfold her. As I was sitting in the front row, I volunteered. She requested a kid glove from some lady in the audience, and receiving this, placed it over her eyes while I tied it securely over her eyes with her handkerchief. I am positive of her inability to see. All were requested to speak right out and identify their message when read. She said that she would make no attempt to answer the questions asked or read them, but that she would give them the impressions which she would receive from them. Then she took a seat at the table at the side opposite the audience, facing the audience with the table between her and the sitters. She opened several of the questions, smoothed them out, and laid them on the table. Then she took one of them and pressed it to her bandaged forehead and began. It was remarkable the effect she created with those present. Women cried aloud at the questions and answers the medium gave out. Finally, she came to my question and said, "I get the influence of a young man. His name is Henry. I get the vibration of a young man who has suffered continual illness." Then the medium, addressing me, asked, Is that correct?" I replied that it was. Then she stated that Henry was well and happy and not to worry about him, as he was beyond all physical suffering. Now, Mr. Houdini, I am convinced that this medium was a fraud. I have attended a number of seances with poor results and have little faith in them, but this medium puzzled me a lot. The question I asked on the slip of paper was, "H, have you any relief from your suffering?" My handwriting was purposefully bad, and I wrote the proper noun in such a manner that it would be hard to distinguish whether the word was Harry or Henry. I did this to discover if the medium actually read the questions or not. I am convinced that she did, but how? Perhaps you can offer an explanation. K.H. Answer to number 6. The method used by this medium is very simple and is not new. It has been greatly improved upon recently. If I am not mistaken, it was first used in the early 70s. When you'd hide the handkerchief with the gloves over her eyes, she simply frowned as much as possible. Then, by raising the eyebrows, she was enabled to see enough to suit her purpose. You understand, I am not exposing a legitimate performer's efforts. When a medium resorts to trickery, I feel that the deception should be explained to prevent their playing upon the gullibility of the public as much as possible. Number 7. Evanston, Illinois. Houdini, courtesy of Weird Tales, Chicago, Illinois. Dear Sir, when modern science dawned, the world was dark with superstition. Fantastic notions fettered the human intellect. Witches, with their bony hands, wove a spell of death and ruin. Sorcerers, with their magic signs and incantations, cast enchantments over the reason of men. Astrology, with its tradition and dogmas, held the common mind in thrall. Against these ideas, the learned voiced a vigorous opposition. The belief in the transmutability of one element into another was opposed to its fundamental conceptions. The transmission of thought through leagues of barren space was cried upon as impossible. The casting of spells was sneered at as unworthy of discussion. The notion of a world of reality interpenetrating the natural world, yet defying the grasp of the natural senses, was brushed aside as a poetic fancy. The idea of physical matter being rendered invisible at will was laughed away. It is noticeable, however, during the past century, although the philosophers have remained steadfast in their attitude of resistance to the claims of the mystics, that the march of discovery has been tending more and more to the occult. Scholars of the old school have given more attention to beliefs they once sneered at. Surgery and medicine today attest to the favorable results obtained by the use of hypnotism. There is a marked difference between the early and present attitude of science toward the phenomena of telepathy. There was no law known to physics which would lend probability to the claim of telepathists. The advent of wireless and radiophone, pulsing their messages through vacancy, have aroused thinking people to the possibility of psychic phenomena. Those advanced in science tend to pave the way for those eager to pursue the doctrines of spiritualism, and the trend is not against, but toward spiritualism, despite the efforts of a dominant, resistant force, and such men as you. It is interesting to learn what you have to say against the ability of those persons commonly said to possess mediumistic powers. I do not deny that the spiritualistic movement is attended by some who practice fraud. But, Houdini, do you know of any movement of scientific research or otherwise in which quackery does not at some time or other make its advent? Is it possible that your mind may be influenced against spiritualism by reason of the fact that in your efforts to entertain or instruct the people before whom you appear, you may find it necessary to be somewhat studied, or, in other words, unreal? I do not mean to say that you are not a practical man, for I believe you are. But I am inclined to think that your life as an entertainer does not lend itself to the proper mental condition to take up the subject of spiritualism, in the frame of mind that you really should have to become an honest investigator. I am sure you are seeking for the truth in this great subject, and I am indeed sorry to see you take the decided stand you have against such learned and sincere men as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Sir Oliver Lodge, and others. It is possible that you may be doing your fellow man great service, but I really feel that in your capacity as a public man, and a man who enjoys the following you do, that you may be committing a grievous error. I trust that in the conducting of this department you will leave it open to both sides of the controversy, if such you may call it. In closing, I wish to say I am pleased to see your appearance in Weird Tales, for I am sure you will be adding quite a little to this publication, which is blazing the trail of a literature loved by men since childhood. Yours very truly, S.T. Answer to number 7. I have carefully digested your letter, and it might interest you to know that for the past 30 years I have been a mystifier not only of the public but of magicians. In fact, the work I do appears so easy to duplicate that up-to-date 4 human beings have lost their lives imitating some of my hazardous stunts, and the reason they apparently seem so easy is because I have been at this so long that it seems to be second nature to me, or possibly a sixth sense. In this way, I have the advantage of everyone attending a seance, as I know how things must be done or must start to be accomplished successfully. I admit that the mediums claim that some seances must be genuine in order to have imitators. I am willing to grant that, but I simply make the statement that I have never attended a seance which was genuine in my 30 years of investigation, and I believe I have attended the seances of the best-known mediums of our times. Some mediums object to magicians as investigators, but 1,000 magicians could not stop the advance of the radio or telephone, irrespective of who or how many would be present. Therefore, I believe that mediums' objections to real investigators is entirely out of place. If at any time you feel that you have something of interest to me in the way of actual proof of psychic phenomena, I promise you that I will make an honest effort to witness same. The very fact that I am constantly before the public eye should give me some opportunity to study the public. Knowing something of the gullibility of the public from a performer's standpoint, I feel I am doing a service in rendering my honest opinion to as many as possible. End of Section 4. Section 5 of Weird Tales presents The Strange World of Harry Houdini. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Hoax of the Spirit Lover by Houdini. One of the most remarkable instances of coincidence that ever came under my observation took place some years ago in Montana, a coincidence so remarkable that if a story or a novel were built around it, the incident would be considered so highly improbable that the yarn would be entirely unconvincing. The incident occurred quite unexpectedly during my attempt to expose a charlatan medium. It made my attempt unnecessary. The medium himself was a victim of the improbable coincidence, and his boasted powers of materializing spirits were proved a shabby fraud. 3 men came to my hotel room in blank and asked me to aid them in exposing a medium whose powers seemed so miraculous as to admit of no explanation except supernatural aid. One of the 3 men was a minister of the gospel. All had tried to pick flaws in the medium's powers and had attended one of his seances without succeeding. One of the men, a lawyer, declared that he was about convinced of the reality of the medium's pretended spiritualistic powers. Were it not that to admit spiritualism opens the door for a wave of superstition and charlatanry, he said, I would quit right now and acknowledge myself convinced. The 3 of us attended a seance last night in the 3rd story of an office building. We locked the door, locked the window, examined the room carefully, examined the medium's portable cabinet, and then the lights were extinguished and spirit materializations took place. There was no possible chance for the medium to have confederates enter the room, nor is there any explanation of the materializations except that given by the medium. I smiled and agreed to do whatever I could to learn what deception the medium was practicing in his seances. It sounds very convincing, I said, but there must be some plausible, natural explanation. If in my study of spiritualistic phenomena I had accepted defeat every time I was baffled by something that I could not explain, then I would not have got very far with my investigations. Instead of saying that there is no explanation except an acceptance of spiritualism, I have said to myself merely, I have not yet found the true explanation. It may be that I shall absolutely fail to pierce the methods of this charlatan who has tricked you. My failure would not prove that the medium had power to call spirits into materialization. There is no reason we should accept spiritualism, which is contrary to all our natural experiences, unless we have absolute proof of it. Failure to disprove spiritualism is far from being positive proof of the reality of spiritualism. I am as open-minded as anybody else on this subject, but I want positive proof. Mere failure to prove fraud in any given case is not a proof of spiritualism. It is simply an indication that the true explanation of the medium's phenomena has not yet been fathomed. It was the following night that I was to assist my friends in attempting to show up the medium. The more I pondered the deception played on them, the more inexplicable seemed the materialization. I was certain that the alleged materialization was nothing more nor less than a flesh-and-blood human being in the employ of the medium. There must be some way of entry to the room. My friends had locked the door and the window. It occurred to me that the medium or his confederate might have had a passkey, or he might have made his way over the transom, or the lock on the window might be broken. I've had too much experience in opening locks to believe very strongly in their power to keep people out of rooms. We met late at night in the third story of an office building, the minister, the lawyer, and myself. The medium and several men and women were already there. The third of the trio who had called on me arrived a little later. He was a grocer or confectioner, I do not remember which. The medium remarked that there were certain psychic influences in the room that worked against any spiritualistic manifestations, and looked pointedly as he spoke at the grocer, who was a small man with cold, skeptical gray eyes and rather a determined chin. I had been introduced to the medium as Mr. Kochler, and evidently he did not suspect me. My eyes traveled around the room. There was but one window, and the door was secured by a Yale lock. It could be opened from the inside. Immediately it flashed through my mind that the medium had a confederate in the room who would open the door and admit the materialization, but the grocer pointed out to me that this could not be done, because there was a light burning in the hall, and this would be visible to those in the room if the door were opened. I answered rather curtly that it should be a comparatively easy matter to extinguish the light in the hall, and my friend merely shrugged his shoulders in reply. There were about a dozen in the room besides the medium when the séance began. Several of these were women, although the usual proportion of women at a spiritualistic séance is much higher. The medium aroused my suspicions immediately by throwing a double curtain over the window, to keep out the light, as he explained. The night was dark, and only a very little light could enter the room from outside. One black curtain would be sufficient. When the medium used two, I felt sure that he wished to conceal the entrance of someone through the window after the room should be plunged in darkness. I had examined the window carefully before the curtains were put up, and satisfied myself there was no means of getting to the window from outside, as there was a drop of 2 stories to the ground and no fire escape near. But the action of the medium in arranging a double curtain over the window caused me to revise my theories. We were required to join hands in a circle around a central table. The lights were put out at the wall switch, and also individually, to prevent any skeptical person in the circle suddenly arising and flashing them on. The grocer, however, at my advice, had brought a strong pocket flashlight, so we were prepared. The séance was opened by the company singing a hymn. Then there was silence for a space and more singing while the medium, tied up in a black bag, went into a trance. The proceedings were directed by a woman who I think was a sincere believer in spiritualism and wanted to make all psychic conditions right for opening spirit communications. I noticed that the singing was loud enough to deaden any sounds a person might make by entering the room either by the door or through the window, and I knew that if the medium had unlocked the window while he was putting up the drapes, it could be opened very easily without being heard above the noise of the singing. I was uneasy, however, and feared that I was on the wrong track, because I saw no way by which an outsider could gain access to the window, which was too far above ground to be reached by ladder. Finally, the spirit manifestations began. There were table rappings, twanging of mandolins, movements of the speaking trumpet, ghostly touches in the dark, all the old claptrap of spiritualistic seances. Then the messages began, the spirit control being ostensibly an Irishman named Mike, who talked in a thick brogue and cracked numerous jokes, even banging the grocer sharply over the head with the mandolin to cool his skepticism. The medium, during all this excitement, was supposed to be in a deep trance, with his hands made useless by being sealed into the black bag, which in its turn was covered with postage stamps on which everyone present had placed marks by which we should know that the medium had not emerged from the bag. This also is a time-worn device of spiritualistic charlatans. It does not hamper the medium's movements as much as might be expected. Mike, the spirit control, then asked every person in the circle to think very hard of some departed friend or relative whom they wished to see, for the psychic conditions were right for a materialization. The room was very hot and close, but an almost imperceptible breath of air fanned my cheek, and I knew that the window had been opened. The medium, of course, had unlocked it when he was putting up the curtains. I moved my chair back out of the circle, and the grocer, who was on my left, moved in a little to take up part of the space I had occupied. I freed my left hand carefully and substituted the grocer's hand in the hand of the woman on my left, who must have thought that I sat on her right, still holding her hand. My purpose in leaving the circle was to make an investigation. I wanted to look at that window. A phosphorescent glow emerging from the cabinet now showed vaguely a human face. Whether of a man or woman, I could not say, but the grocer and lawyer were there to attend to the materialization. It was my purpose to learn how the materialization had gained access to the room. I wormed my way down into the cabinet, and through an opening in the back I reached the window very easily. The double curtain bulged out with a slight breeze, and I knew that the window was open. I poked my head out and was amazed at what I found. To the left of the window, a ladder was hanging from the roof above my head. It was a fireman's extensible hooking ladder about 15 feet long, which had been thrust out of the window above and attached to the top of the building so that the medium's materialization could climb down from the window in the 3rd story. Behind me, a scream arose which I did not take time to investigate. It was a girl's scream, and the name Marion was repeated several times. I tried to push the hooking ladder off from the roof, but I could not dislodge it. The ladder was in 2 sections, and the lower section, being loose, merely slid upward in its grooves. The upper part of the hooking ladder was securely attached to the roof and could not be lifted out unless I could raise the rigid upper part of the ladder. So I climbed out and went up to the window in the story above. Behind me still arose the girl's scream, "Marion, Marion, oh God, it's Marion." I found the window in the 4th story open. I sat on the sill, lifted the hooking ladder from its position, and shoved it in the room. The escape of the medium's materialization was cut off, and my own return by the window was also blocked. I found the door locked from the inside. Evidently, the materialization wished to make himself secure from intruders while he waited for the singing to tell him that the time had come for him to put out his ladder, attach it to the roof, and descend to take his part in the seance. I made my way quickly through the corridor and down the stairs to the room of the seance and found everything in turmoil. I had missed the unmasking of the fraud, but I had prevented the escape of the spirit. What happened while I was going out of the window and removing the ladder, if told in fiction, would seem like stretching the long arm of coincidence so far that it would break under the strain. That is why I said at the beginning of this article that the story would be unconvincing if told by a novelist because of its improbability. I had wormed my way into the cabinet and was approaching the window when the grocer flashed his pocket light upon the supposed materialization. A woman's scream split the darkness, and the flashlight was violently knocked from the grocer's hand, but the young woman had thrown her arms around the ghost and was covering his face with kisses, screaming, "Marion, Marion, it's you! For God's sake, speak to me, Marion!" While some tried to find the switch, only to find the lights turned off at the chandelier too, someone, probably the medium, was striking the girl's hands with a blackjack, endeavoring to break her hold, and the ghost was muttering in great fright, "Francis, let go of me! You're smothering me, Francis!" and fighting to free himself. The combined efforts of the medium and the ghost finally freed him from the girl's hysterical embrace, but the means of escape was cut off by my removing of the ladder. The ghost was a real flesh and blood one, and could not dematerialize into the world of shadows. The girl Frances, whose surname I will not mention here as she is still living, had attended the seance in good faith, and when the spirit control asked everyone present to hold in mind the image of a dear departed one, so that the spirit might be aided in showing itself, she concentrated her thoughts on her fiancé, who had died a little less than a year before. Out of the cabinet, dimly seen by a phosphorescent glow from the features of the ghost, stepped the materialization. The girl stared, hoping that this was indeed her fiancé, trying to believe, her heart beating between skepticism and faith, when the grocer's flashlight lit up the features distinctly. It was only for an instant, for the flashlight was knocked from the grocer's hand almost immediately, but that instant was enough. The ghost that had emerged from the cabinet was the man she had been engaged to marry, the man whom she had seen laid away in his coffin and buried in the earth. Is it any wonder that the poor girl became hysterical? Is it any wonder that she threw her arms about her beloved dead and sought to hold him in the land of the living? Possessed for the moment of an unnatural strength, she held him tight, screaming her love at him until the struggles of the ghost and the cruel blackjack of the medium had broken her hold. The materialization, of course, was a paid employee of the medium, and he really was the girl's fiancé. It transpired that the man who lived in Chicago had a twin brother in Wyoming, who was slowly dying of consumption and had gone west to work on a ranch in hope that the high altitude would help him. Frances knew of the existence of this twin brother, but she had never seen him. Marion, realizing that the end was near for his brother, had himself heavily insured in his brother's name. He sent for the brother who came to Chicago while Frances was in Montana with relatives. In Chicago, Marion changed lodgings to break contact with those who knew him, and he took his brother's name and gave his own name to his brother. The brother died in a Chicago hospital under the name of Marion, but Marion was speeding west to Wyoming when the end came. Letters from Frances in Montana were found in the pockets of the dead man, and a telegram brought the heartbroken girl back to Chicago to attend the funeral of her fiancé, as she supposed. Marion, by this fraud, was able to collect the insurance on his own death. The money did him very little good, however, for he squandered it in mining stocks and gambling and other means, and was soon penniless. He then obtained employment as assistant to the charlatan medium, and did materializations for him, with his face smeared with phosphorescent paint that gave a pale, unearthly radiance to his features in the dark, and yet did not light them up enough so that anyone could certainly recognize his face. It was the flashlight of the grocer that accomplished that. The strangest part of the whole occurrence is that the girl and the man should meet in this strange way. He had not the slightest notion in the world that his fiancée was in that room, while she, of course, believed him dead. The insurance company prosecuted the man for fraud, but the medium who employed him departed suddenly and may still be preying, under another name, upon the credulities of those who want to communicate with their beloved dead. He was a clever magician, and under whatever name he perpetrates his fraudulent tricks, he should be very successful. It is much more lucrative to be a charlatan medium than an honest magician, for rich dupes pay well, whereas the amount of money that can be made by parlor magic is relatively small. The girl Frances refused to have anything to do with her fiancé thereafter, for the fraud he practiced both on her and on the insurance company killed her love. She went to the hospital, suffered from a nervous collapse after her hysteria at the séance, but she recovered and afterward returned to Chicago. End of section 5. Section 6 of Weird Tales presents The Strange World of Harry Houdini. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ben Tucker. Ask Houdini. Weird Tales, May, June, July, 1924. This department is open to all readers of Weird Tales who have some question to propound. Houdini will attempt to answer any logical question on subjects relating to physical or psychic phenomena. Readers are requested not to duplicate questions that have already been answered by Houdini in these columns. Questions pertaining to the future and personalities will receive no attention. They must have a general interest, otherwise they will not be considered. All correspondence will be handled by Houdini personally, and he is especially interested in hearing from those having unique experiences not easily explained. The Publishers. Number 1, Cumberland, Maryland. My dear Houdini, what is meant by a clairaudient? I have heard this word mentioned among spiritualists, and have never had an explanation I could understand. K.L. Answer. Clairaudient is French for clear hearing, and clairvoyant is French for clear seeing. A clairaudient, in the parlance of the spiritualists, is a medium who hears spirit voices, and a clairvoyant is one who sees spirit forms. The word clairvoyant, however, usually includes both meanings. Number 2, Madison, Wisconsin. Dear Mr. Houdini, I am indeed interested to learn that you are taking up the subject of spiritualism and other matters of a bizarre nature in Weird Tales. It is not my intention to discuss the subject of spiritualism with you, but I wish you would answer frankly the question below. Believing that most people approach the hour of death with fear and apprehension regardless of the scientific proofs of the existence of psychic phenomena, don't you think that belief in the religion of spiritualism is to be encouraged if only that it helps to relieve this fear, and that it would to assuage the grief of those who mourn for a departed one? C.A. Answer. No, I do not think the belief in spiritualism ought to be encouraged until it is definitely proven to be honest, unless you wish to take the viewpoint that we ought to believe there is a Santa Claus. I would like to believe in a Santa Claus, I think, but you don't find fraud mediums who look upon their work as of a Santa Claus nature. I believe that one ought to face the inevitable with all the courage possible, knowing full well that we must face the great disintegration. Number 3, Shelbyville, Indiana.
Dear Houdini, I have before me a well-known spiritualistic publication which devotes a lot of space to your activities in the world of magic, and especially to your remarkable escapes. In view of your present stance on the subject of spiritualism, I am curious to learn what you have to say concerning the following. The controversy raging around the performance of a lady entertainer who, posing as a medium, recently mystified an audience composed of people well known in spiritualism and psychical research, reopens the question as to the possibility of conjurers doing some of their sensational tricks by means other than normal. My friend Harry Houdini, the famous American escape artist, has more than once been credited with psychic powers, by means of which he is supposed to perform some of his miracles. Though Houdini would be the last person to pretend to powers he does not possess, he has confided to me the fact that there have been occasions when he has been helped in his performances by some unseen and unknown force, an intangible friend in need who has rescued him from many an awkward dilemma. 2 of these incidents I will relate. I will add, en passant, that Houdini is not an adherent of the spiritual philosophy, but like the majority of people is willing to be convinced. A favorite advertising stunt, that is the only word for it, of Houdini's is to allow himself to be locked up in the strongest cell of the local prison of the town in which he happens to be performing. In the presence of witnesses, he then escapes by manipulating the locks and freeing himself. Houdini was once playing a big town in one of the western states, and had undertaken to escape from the exceptionally strong cell of the local jail. He was stripped, placed in the cell in a nude condition, and the heavy door was then closed. The key of the modern and complicated lock was then turned upon him in the presence of witnesses, the door tested, the keyhole sealed, and the key handed to the governor of the jail, who was taking a lively interest in the proceedings. The signal was then given to the occupant of the cell that all was ready. Houdini immediately approached the door, placed one hand upon it, and to the accompaniment of a sharp click as the bolt shot back, the door slowly opened. In something under 3 seconds, Houdini was out of that cell. It would be difficult to say who was the more astonished, the governor or Houdini, who at first thought that some mistake had been made, and that the door had been prematurely opened by a warder. But the seals were intact, and all the witnesses vouched for the fact that no one was near the lock. The question as to what opened the door is still unanswered. The second incident is equally strange, though of a different character. Houdini, besides being able to break out of places, can break into them. A favorite feat of his is to open a safe or strong room secured by complicated locks. A large banking corporation with headquarters in New York had recently installed a new strong room, secured by the latest time locks in its chief office. At a board meeting soon after the completion of the room, a director jokingly remarked that they ought to test the security of the room by challenging Houdini to open it. Though the remark was made in jest, the directors decided to act upon the suggestion, and Houdini was invited to test his skill upon the new locks, whose kinematic elements were last word and ingenuity. Houdini accepted the challenge without knowing exactly the type of lock with which he had to deal. The mechanism of the lock in question was the application of watch or time movements, so as to regulate the period during which an obstructing bolt was to be kept in its locked position. In a suitable case, mounted on the inside of the strong room door, were 4 distinct chronometer movements. Each movement, instead of having ordinary clock hands, possessed a simple dial divided into 72 hours, or 3 days, and was arranged to make 1 revolution in that time. Each disc had a pin projecting from it, so placed as to move or slide a simple rod when the time had come for unlocking, the rod in its turn releasing the obstructing bolt. This then fell down by its own weight out of the way. In setting this lock, it was only necessary to wind up each movement for the predetermined number of hours and minutes that the strong room door was to remain shut. Any one of the movements was capable of alone putting the clock off guard, but 4 were provided in case of a possible breakdown on the part of 1 or 2. There was no keyhole or the slightest aperture in the door, the large main bolts that kept it shut being worked by energy stored in the springs, and these were tripped up and allowed to come into action by the timer at the predetermined hour. The timing mechanism of the door was set to a different hour each day, 2 persons only being in the secret. These were the president of the bank and the chief cashier, who consulted his principal as to the time of opening.
It was arranged that Houdini should be at the bank at 2:30 p.m. on a given afternoon, and 1 hour was to be allotted him for his trial. A distinguished company of prominent New Yorkers was invited to meet the wonder worker. At the appointed time, the wizard appeared, and he at once started to inspect the strong room door, the exterior surface of which was merely a massive sheet of steel. Houdini at once realized he had a difficult proposition before him and began considering how he should tackle it. Suddenly, across the strong room door, the figures 437 appeared to Houdini in luminous characters. That the figures were purely subjective there can be no doubt, as no one except a magician saw them. After a while, the figures disappeared, but they were fixed indelibly in his mind, and he could think of nothing else. Everywhere he looked, he seemed to see the cryptic numbers, which impressed him so much that he became convinced that the figures were meant for his guidance. So he determined to make a test. He asked permission to take the remainder, 15 minutes had already elapsed, of his test hour between 4 and 5 o'clock the same afternoon. The small committee arranging the experiment agreed, and he then informed his audience that he would return at 4:36, at the same time synchronizing his watch with the bank clock. Houdini could not help noticing the puzzled looks exchanged between the president and the cashier, the only living persons who knew at what hour the room could be opened. Punctually at 4:36, Houdini arrived, walked straight up to the door of the strong room, placed his back against it, and said, "Gentlemen, within 1 minute I will be on the other side of this door." It can be imagined with what breathless interest the spectators counted the ensuing seconds. Some pulled out their watches to assure themselves that Houdini would be literally as good as his word. Almost on the tick of the 60th second, there was a whirring noise from the interior of the room, and the bolts could be heard being automatically withdrawn. It was the work of a moment for Houdini to swing open the door and enter the strong room. To the intense amazement of the spectators, and to the no less astonishment of the president and his cashier, who are probably wondering to this day how Houdini discovered the exact time the lock would function. The secret was divulged some years ago to a select few. My readers have the choice of telepathy, coincidence, or some unconscious psychic power on the part of Houdini to explain the curious incident I've just recorded. Answer. As to my work consists of a willing acknowledgement of manipulation, and as I accomplish it by my knowledge of the construction of locks, I do not believe you would ask me to expose my secrets. However, any time that you meet me personally, I will explain how I opened the time lock, but I do not care to broadcast this information at the present time. Number 4, New York, New York. Dear Mr. Houdini, perhaps you are familiar with the story of the play, Outward Bound, now running in this city. I saw the play and enjoyed it very much. I quote you on the comments of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle on this play. In the main, it was a remarkably accurate presentation of one aspect of the life after death. On the narrow stage of the steamship were shown a number of people who were dead, but who did not know that they were dead. That sometimes happens. Another correct feature was the absence of change in personal appearance. There is one bad line in the play, and that is where Scrubby, the wonderful steward, on being asked if there is any wireless on board, replies, "No, we have no wireless." He should have said, "The receivers are all out of order." That would have been true. Those who had passed over could send to us, but too often we had not sufficient knowledge to receive or to understand their signals. Now, I am thoroughly satisfied in my mind that Sir Arthur is sincere in his work. I do not distinctly remember the lines from the play quoted above, but I am of the opinion that Doyle is right. I have read all of his works on psychic phenomena and kindred subjects, and must say that he is almost invulnerable to attack, except from the point of veracity as to his actual experiences, and I would not accuse him of misstating what he actually thinks he has seen or heard. Invariably, the name of Doyle comes up during a discussion of psychic phenomena or spiritualism. The antis generally say Doyle is wrong, but why don't they say Doyle is wrong as are Sir Oliver Lodge, Sir William Crookes, Lombroso, and others? Despite every conceivable effort to kill it, spiritualism lives and will continue to live. The religion of spiritualism is an ideal one. Its followers are legion, and this religion offers the one and only solution to the end of religious and race hatred. I do not deny that there are a great many charlatans and frauds practicing under its cloak, and this is deplored by the many honest and sincere followers. I'm curious to hear your views on sleep. Do you think that when you lie down and fall asleep, you cannot remember the moment you do, that you pass from one state of existence into another?
Thanking you for any attention you may care to give this, I am cordially yours, CD.
Answer. You are mistaken when you suggest that the antis generally single out Doyle, for they do say that the rest of the scientists who support spiritualism are also mistaken. Look up the mistakes made by Sir William Crookes. Read the Quarterly of Science for 1874. Read Professor Zolmer's description of his seance with Dr. Henry Slade. There is no doubt that Slade misrepresented, and I hold his written confession, which has never been published, but which you will find in my new book, A Magician Among the Spirits. Read Professor Richet's book, just off the press, 30 Years of Investigations. He speaks of clairvoyance and ranks as genuine some mediums who I have personally investigated and whom I found cheating. They could never pass a legitimate test. I agree with you that the religion of spiritualism is an ideal one. I do not say that there is no such thing. I am perfectly willing to be converted. My mind is open, and I am not attacking spiritualism as a religion, but only attacking the fraud mediums and the miracle mongers. You ask for my views on sleep. Strange to say, we spend almost a third of our lives in this peaceful state. Some humans require more sleep than others. I rarely take more than 6 or 7 hours out of the 24. I use sleep as a necessity, others as a luxury, and still others as a life waster. There are a number of books on the subject. I believe that sleep rests the energy of life, and that the tenant, yourself, who occupies your body, permits the landlord, nature, to make repairs in your abode while you sleep. If human beings would realize that they hold only a limited lease on their bodies, then they would not abuse them so unknowingly. Number 5, Columbia, Missouri.
Dear Mr. Houdini, do you believe that a person who suddenly lost a very dear friend would naturally be in a better position to communicate with the departed than one less acquainted, if there actually is such a thing as communication with the dead?
H.J. Answer. Yes, I positively believe that any person who has lost a dear friend or relative would be in a much better position to communicate with the lost one. I think that is why the shock of suddenly losing beloved ones often causes persons to imagine things. Number 6, Eyrie, Pennsylvania. Dear sir, have you ever heard of John Slater, whose home was in California? I think he's the man who comes to Lilydale, New York every summer and lectures and gives readings. What do you think of his work? DWN. Answer. You ask my opinion of John Slater. What do you mean, as a human being, as a clairvoyant, as a spiritualistic evangelist, or as an impossible lecturer before a high-grade audience? Number 7, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
Dear Mr. Houdini, in the first installment of your story, The Spirit Fakers of Hermannstadt, you state that you were playing Vienna at the time. If I'm not mistaken, I had the pleasure of viewing one of your performances, though it might have been in Berlin. I was very much interested in the story, and knowing as I do the superstitions of those people, I can appreciate the predicament you were placed in. I await your further experiences with interest. V.L. Deb.
Answer. Yes, I have appeared in Berlin a number of times. My first appearance there was at the Berlin Winter Garden about 25 years ago. I played there consecutively for almost 15 years, and was then brought back as a feature of the Hippodrome Circus by Director Bush. As a matter of record, I have played almost every principal city in the world except in South Africa and South America. Number 8, Montreal, PQ.
Dear sir, it seems a trait peculiar to magicians to make war against the religions of spiritualism. Despite the incessant warfare it has lived through, it stands today on firm foundation and has marked a steady growth. The writer is a native of Scotland and has had the pleasure of seeing you perform on several occasions abroad. I want to relate to you the facts of a so-called exposure of spiritualists in Glasgow in February 1878. Some of them are a trifle vague, and for this reason I refer to the book of James Robertson entitled Spiritualism, The Open Door of the Unseen Universe for authenticity. This experience I have found to be general among so-called exposés. No man was ever more liberal in speech and condemned intolerance with a louder voice than Professor Huxley, who certainly was one of the strongest forces of the age. Notwithstanding his clear-headedness, he became the dupe of a vulgar American showman, and for a time allowed prejudice to dominate his reasoning faculties. Though he had said that no event is too extraordinary to be impossible, yet he would never open his mind to the possibility of spiritual phenomena being true. It was beyond the extraordinary. He had refused to investigate the subject when the Dialectical Society called for his presence, saying, "If it is true, it does not interest me." He had repeated the same sentiments to Alfred Russel Wallace, yet when he heard there was a person in America who was prepared to expose the whole matter, he opened his arms wide to receive him.
The clever American played his cards well, so well as to dupe the most intellectual man in the country. The story he fabricated was greedily accepted. He said he had a dear friend who, while in a state of feeble health, had fallen into the hands of the spiritualists, and had become insane. Roused by the wrongs done to this friend, his sole mission was to execute vengeance by exposing the arts, by which the imposture was practiced on the soft-headed and credulous portion of the American and British public. He had succeeded in discovering the vulgar, but skillfully veiled secrets, and now stern virtue called upon him to lay bare to the world the full explanation of the frauds. Robert Dale Owen had been a credulous fool, Professor Crooks a weak-minded dupe, Professor De Morgan a person without brains, and Alfred Russel Wallace and Cromwell Varley were blinded and incapable observers. The great American high-souled gentleman of independent fortune was mightier than all the scientific and literary men who had attested the truths of spiritual phenomena. He had grappled with the mystery, and for humanity's sake alone had come out into the open with a clean soul to do the world a great service. No one thought of asking his credentials. So hateful was the word spiritualism that they swallowed his story without questioning about the dear friend who had been caught in its toils, and the independent means of high-souled and spirited exposure. The opponents of spiritualism were only too overjoyed to find a missile to hurl at it and its supporters. Huxley was delighted and patronized the errant quack in London. Genuine phenomena could not interest him. The spurious claimed his attention at once. The crafty American, who could not impose on the spiritualists of America, found a fruit field on English soil. Huxley wrote to some of the professors of the Glasgow and Edinburgh universities asking them to take this great champion of truth under their wing. How much the showman did to pull the strings himself is not known, but in February 1879, the Glasgow newspapers were flooded with long advertisements to the effect that Washington Irving Bishop, B.A., which I should read Bold Adventurer, had been invited by the prominent men of Glasgow to give a startling exposure of spiritualism, an exposition by human means of all the startling manifestations claimed by the spiritualists to be done by the spirits of the dead. The man of ordinary capacity could scarcely have read the flaming announcements without seeing that here was a showman, pure and simple, who knew his business, knew how to bring out telling headlines so as to draw the public. In case all who were interested might not have a chance of seeing for themselves how feeble minds could be imposed upon, 2 nights were to be devoted to this noble attempt to save the world from credulity and folly. The prices of admission were 5 shillings, 3 shillings, 6 pounds, 2 shillings, and a few 1 shilling seats. But as money was far from the object in view, it was reiterated in every corner that the vindication of truth and saving of the weak-minded was the sole aim this gentleman of independent means had in coming to Glasgow. All the proceeds were to be devoted to the Western Infirmary. It will scarcely be credited that among the names of those who signed the requisite document which brought this adventurer into our midst were John Caird, the venerated principal of the university, and his scholarly brother Edward, now master of Balliol College, Oxford, Professor Barry, afterwards Sheriff of Lanarkshire, Professors Blackburn, Buchanan, Cleland, Cowan, Dixon, Veitch, Grant, Jebb, Nichol, and Sir William Gardner, who had said clairvoyance came from a diseased condition of the faculty of wonder, whatever oracular meaning this might have. The most prominent advocate and supporter of the man bishop, however, was Sir William Thompson, now Lord Kelvin. A few years later he acted even more ridiculously than the opponent of Galileo, the professor of philosophy of Padua, of whom I have spoken. Mr. Stead had asked Lord Kelvin to interest himself in borderland subjects, but he replied, "I have nothing to do with borderland. I believe that nearly everything in hypnotism and clairvoyance is imposture," and the rest bad observation. Mr. Stead very aptly says, "This oracular dictum will probably live in the history of the progress of mankind side by side with the equally positive assertions of the Lord Kelvins of their day, in condemnation of Galvani and of Harvey, whose discovery of the circulation of the blood exposed him to the ridicule of the leading scientists of his time." It was not the university professors alone who interested themselves in Irving Bishop's beneficent work of exploding what they considered, if they considered the matter at all, a hurtful fallacy. But all sections of the church, the defenders of ancient superstitions, were determined that no new claimant should ever enter the field. So we had Archbishop Eyrie and the Father Munro as representatives of that church which has ever sought to stifle everything new. The established church had its representative in Dr. Burns of the cathedral, while the Free Church had its liberal Marcus Dodds, Ross Taylor, and others. Episcopalians and United Presbyterians had also their share in the great honor of extending the invitation to the marvelous, self-sacrificing, and truth-devoted man of independent means who was to put an end to the existence of spiritualism. The night came when the so-called spirit manifestations, which had for so long eluded the detection and imposed upon the credulity of men, would be laid bare. Lord Kelvin, who never, I suppose, attended a genuine spirit circle in his life, was in the chair and helped the magician, just as boys carry out the instructions of the showman at juggling and mesmeric entertainments. He had crowds of his educated colleagues with him, who seemed to enjoy what was presented. Those in the audience who had seen good conjuring thought it a most tame exhibition of legerdemain, but the prominent names on the committee carried it through. There was no exposition of clairvoyance, materialization, or rapping, only an exposition of the folly of learned professors. The spiritualists present laughed at the clumsy performance, and if it had been repeated for years, it could not have affected the beliefs of a single spiritualist. There had been many conjurers who, with the aid of machinery, had done some clever things which caused people to wonder. But Irving Bishop was a man who had not even well learned his business. I wonder what the newspapers would say the next day. And for once I was ashamed of the press. I recollect reading a leading article in the Evening Times of the period, and saying to myself, this leader will be quoted some day as an example of the ignorant and bigoted spirit which prevailed. I recently took the trouble to hunt it up in the Mitchell Library, and there it was as I had remembered it. In these days, when men like Sir Oliver Lodge, Professor Richet, F.W.H. Myers, and others have spoken out so clearly as to the objective reality of the phenomena, it looks as if it had been dug out of some ancient manuscript. Maniacs, illusions, and impostures are difficult to kill. It is doubtful whether the startling exposure which Washington Irving Bishop is giving of the thing called modern spiritualism, the silliest delusion, wickedest imposture of our time, will be its death blow in Glasgow. With few exceptions, the immense audience assembled did not require to be convinced of the supreme humbug of spiritualism. They want to see the barefaced lie exposed by a clever man, who has sounded all its miserable shallows, pretty much as they would go to see an infamous scoundrel exposed in a court of law. Mr. Bishop is an American of independent means whose dear friend, while in a state of feeble health, fell into the fangs of spiritualists and became insane under their precious trickeries. He has succeeded in discovering their vulgar but skillfully veiled secrets, and is engaged in laying them bare to the world. Then we had a description of the tricks which had been the stock in trade of the regular conjurer for years. Lord Kelvin's appropriate remarks regarding the pernicious influence of the delusion are quoted as being masterful and conclusive. And the leader concludes with these words, "A few presumably strong men have had their brains softened by seriously touching the imposture." I suppose Sir William Crookes, Wallace, and Varley were meant. Mr. Bishop's crusade may help to clear the noxious vapors from the eyes and minds of a few. There were 2 nights of the show, and at the conclusion the Western Infirmary naturally waited for the proceeds with which the benevolent American was to dower them. But professors and infirmary had alike been sold. Mr. Bishop was needy, and had made sure his own people would draw the money, and that he would keep it once it was drawn. He coolly pocketed the entire proceeds, several £100, less some £20 or so, as their share of the spoil. All had been duped alike. It was a clever swindle. The professors and clergymen, and the potent assertion of independent means in avenging his dear friend's wrongs, had the desired effect with the public, and the modern Cagliostro rushed away with the takings, leaving his silly dupes lamenting. It had been sufficient for Mr. Bishop to seem good and excellent, and although his credentials would not have stood any test, the eager desire on the part of the learned to believe anything unfavorable to spiritualism made them liable to fall into the net which he had prepared. The press had little to say about the robbery when it was found out. The matter was never fully opened to public gaze and was soon forgotten. Professor Huxley would be blamed, no doubt, for introducing such an arrant knave to respectable Glasgow society. McGinn. Answer. You are wrong. Magicians do not war against the religion of spiritualism, but against fraud, mediums, and miracle-mongers. I do not deny that there may be honest mediums. But in my investigations of more than a quarter of a century, I have never found any medium who stood the acid test of legitimate investigation by experienced men who have met all qualifications to be justly termed investigators. A scientist is not always qualified to be on the investigating committee. In fact, I believe that his trained mentality really disqualifies him until he has been initiated in the general manipulation of fraud mediums' tricks. I can name a number of our brilliant men who have been deceived and cheated by the simplest tricks. Therefore, it does not surprise me that the scientific men you mentioned were fooled, or rather taken advantage of, by Bishop. I know the history of Bishop, the mind reader. He met his death in a peculiar manner in New York City some 30 years ago. If I remember correctly, it was in the Green Room Club, and he had just given a demonstration of locating hidden articles when he fell into a cataleptic fit, despite the fact that he carried in his pocket letters of instruction that his mother was to be notified in case of his sudden death, and that under no circumstances was any operation to be performed upon him without permission. The surgeons held an autopsy on his living body. Bishop's mother went to court when all this information became public, and you will find the entire proceedings in an article which I wrote for Conjurer's magazine, wherein you will find reproduced the photograph of the casket with the body of Bishop and his mother standing alongside. You can plainly see the incision, showing the complete upper part of his skull separated from the lower part. His mother stooped over to kiss his forehead when the entire upper portion fell away. This must have deranged her mind, for she became somewhat eccentric. As she was in wont, several of my friends supplied her with the necessities of life until she passed away in Rochester. The Countess Nicholas, Bishop's mother, had in some way befriended a man whose property was seized during the Civil War, and who claimed immense property in the South with accumulated interest that amounted to more than $100 million. Countess Nicholas claimed this was given to her by this friend, and at her death I was willed $30 million. Unfortunately, up to the present day, I've been unable to find how substantial or mythical this fortune is. Upon investigation, I have found that the fortune part of the story is true, but it has been outlawed by the years. Bishop was never looked upon as a genuine mind reader, but purely and simply as a muscle reader and imitator of J. Randall Brown, who is still alive. Stuart Cumberland was the best known of the muscle readers, and I knew him intimately. During Bishop's visit with the Tsar and Tsarina of Russia, Bishop found out their willingness to believe in spiritualism, and he received valuable jewelry as a token of their esteem, and for his entertainments. He had a controversy with the editor of the London Truth, in which he came out second best, but he audaciously advertised that he had won. You mentioned Bishop, but you overlooked the splendid service rendered by the English magician Maskelyne, who exposed every charlatan in the past 40 years and never once failed to show the deception. Mediums do not like magicians at their seances, claiming that they are a disturbing element. But what could 10,000 magicians do in front of a radio machine? Nothing, except express their amazement at one of the greatest inventions of our time. Number 9. San Francisco, California. Dear Houdini, you say you want to expose fraud mediums, but are there not also legitimate mediums who can stand every test imposed on them? Answer. Perhaps there are such, but I have never met any. To show you how difficult it is to find a genuine medium, let us go back to 1857, when the Boston Courier offered $500 for a medium who could successfully meet the test. Such offers have been repeatedly made since, and a similar offer was backed up by the $60,000 willed to the University of Pennsylvania by Henry Seibert. In rough figures, during the past 60 years, there's been offered almost $100,000 for a medium who could meet a genuine test. Yet no one has ever been granted any bonus for meeting such a test. Number 10, Brooklyn, New York. Dear Sir, perhaps the question that I have in mind does not come under the category named in Weird Tales as psychic, but knowing of the extensive library that you possess pertaining to magic and kindred subjects, I'm confident that I may obtain from you what I am unable to find elsewhere. In Eliphas Levi's work on transcendental magic and other books of similar character, I meet with frequent references to the ritual of the Black Mass. Nowhere can I find a detailed description of that ritual, and as I am attempting to compile a history of human superstition, I am desirous of obtaining the entire ritual, rather than attempting to piece together such fragments as I have been able to glean from the New York Public Library. I enclose postage for return answer if I may hope for a personal reply. Otherwise, allow me to thank you very cordially for the answer through the medium of Weird Tales.
May I, as a constant reader of your magazine, offer my appreciation, as such, for your contribution to that periodical. R.G.R. Answer.
Rarely will you find reference to the Black Mass. My opinion is that it is a sort of convention of devils, and there the witches, wizards, and sorcerers confess. This is supposed to take place on the Devil's Sabbath. I have never seen a complete description of their rituals. Spence in his occult encyclopedia gives very little information on this subject. I remember reading a description of the Black Mass and the rituals. Some of it, if my memory serves me right, was photographed in Sweden, and was of such a nature that the picture, which cost a fortune, has never been seen by the public. It was called, I believe, Superstition of the Ages. I saw this film run, but up to the present time it has never been seen outside of a private projection room. It took more than 2 years to make it. According to Funk and Wagnall's Black Mass is a burlesque on the Christian Mass. Number 11, Daytona Beach, Florida.
Dear Mr. Houdini, I would appreciate it very much if you could tell me if Swami Bhakta Vishita, Hindu master and author of the development of seership, Hindu, and other Oriental methods, and I believe other books, has or has not been found to be a fraud. If he has not been found to be a fraud, I would thank you very much to let me know the titles of his other books, and in what order they follow each other, and whether they can be had. I accidentally got hold of his book on seership and became greatly interested. In fact, I'm making a study of his methods, and if he is not a fraud, I would like to get more of his works. But if he is known to be a fraud, I will waste no more time on him, hence my questions. Now, another question. A lady came here this winter from Lilydale, New York, and has been conducting a spiritualist church in the Moose Hall in Daytona, Florida, all the season. I have attended it, and she professes to be a medium or mediumistic. I would like to ask if she is a fraud. Any works that you could recommend to me on the occult or psychic order would be appreciated very much. I mean, reliable ones, of course. N.S.J. Answer.
Hindu psychics in all branches are the most to be guarded against. I do not know what good it will do you to read their books, unless you are able to read upon them and eventually refute their teachings. If any one of them possessed 1/3 of the power the Hindu psychics all claim to possess, he could come forward and claim the huge rewards awaiting true psychics. This applies to all who did not come forward for the public test. Incidentally, you mentioned Lilydale. That is the breeding place for psychic fanatics who are consciously and subconsciously frauds. Number 12, Lewistown, Montana. Dear Sirs, I am writing you one of my actual experiences. One day, when I was in the age between 17 and 18, I was riding a horse on my uncle's ranch, and I had an experience I shall never forget. It was late in the evening. I was riding around a bunch of pine trees when my horse shied and just about threw me. I looked into the pine trees and saw a figure which resembled a human hanging on a limb of a big tree. Its hands were tied behind its back and a rope was around its neck. The air seemed funny all around those pines. It seemed moldy. I spurred my horse closer and got off. I walked nearer and the thing vanished as if it went into thin air. Chills began to run up and down my spine. I lost no time in getting to my horse and galloping for home. When I got home, I told my uncle about it. He would not believe me. So several days later, he was riding by there about dusk, and he saw it also. When he got home, he was all excited about it, and asked the hired men if they had seen it, but all of them said they had not. One day, our neighbor rode over to the ranch and said there was a dead man hanging over in a group of pines. All the men at our ranch went over there, but it was gone when they got there. One day, when I was riding around, I went over to the cabin of an old trapper who went by the name of Big Dick. His right name was Robert Holt. I told him about it, and he said that he would wait till dusk and then go over there. When dusk came, we went over, and it was there. He walked up to it and was going to touch it with a stick when a dog jumped out from a clump of bushes and made a snap at Dick's hand. Dick jumped back and screamed. Out of the dog's mouth came a tongue of fire that burned for a moment and went out, but the dog continued to show its teeth and snarl. Its eyes glowed like fire. But the body of the man vanished. Then the dog seemed to leap into the air and vanish. I had stood there all the while, watching, with my mouth wide open and chills running up and down my spine. After a while, I came out of it and began to talk to Dick. Then he asked, "What do you think of that?"
I said I did not know what to think. He caught his horse and said he had seen enough of that thing for a while. I learned afterwards that a horse thief had been caught and hanged there about 30 years before, and that he had a dog with him, and that a cattleman had said, "We might as well kill his dog too, so we will be rid of all of his relations forever." They left him and his dog both dead by the tree. Neither he nor his dog was ever buried. J.P. Answer. Your narrative seems like the creation of the fertile mind of fiction. It savors strongly of The Hound of Baskerville by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I should say that time, place, and general environment were favorable to vivid imaginations, that no better field for action could have been selected than a pine grove on a dark night. It is not difficult to conjecture that witnesses such as you cite are of the type most susceptible to superstitious influences. I have slept in cemeteries, I should say at least 24 times, and my imagination caused me to think that the place was peopled, and every moment I expected to have a host of the shadows come up and mock me. My father, who also investigated phenomena, and who was one of the pioneers in 1848, related a story that in his student days one of the boys in his class had to drive a nail in a wooden cross at midnight in the local cemetery, and as he turned to flee, a hand reached out and held him fast. He shrieked and shouted for help, screaming out that he was held by a ghostly hand, but by the time assistance arrived he was dead on the grave. It appeared that in driving the nail in he had accidentally in his excitement nailed down the coat. His mind had conjectured a hand reaching out from the grave and securing him. There is no doubt that your mind conjured up the things you write in your letter. My father also told of a hazing at which a man was going through a certain ordeal and he was supposed to have his head cut off, so his hazers struck him with a towel soaked in ice water, and he was worked up to such a pitch that he died of the shock. About 6 months ago, a man was arrested in Berlin for a thought murder. Every morning he had called up his rival, a butcher who had consumption, and asked him if he were not dead yet. This preyed so on the butcher's mind that it actually hastened his death. The man who had harassed him was put on trial, as witnesses claimed that the sick man was really killed by the very thought of expecting this call every morning. Number 13, Grand Rapids, Michigan. Dear Sir, propaganda, what misery is created in thy name? Having read your department in weird tales, I want to say that I consider it propaganda, because why not attack Catholicism or the Jewish religion, or some of the other isms also, whilst you are out on this campaign? But no, it must be spiritualism. I wonder if you realize what glorious wisdom and philosophy may be attained through this same spiritualism. You are looking at the psychical and psychic phenomena side of the angle, but I am looking from a spiritual standpoint. Mr. Houdini, I'm sure you're committing a grievous error, because I know there are genuine mediums as well as quacks. Not all resort to trickery, I would have you know. There are frauds in all things at every turn in life, but whatever ye are seeking, that shall ye also find. I know of many people with the same turn of mind as yourself, and knowing the value of thought forces, a knowledge taken from Oriental occultism, I know they can produce, whilst sitting in a seance, disastrous results to all concerned. If they would study chemistry, astronomy, physiology, and psychometry, as well as the human brain, they would not be up to such schoolboy pranks. I can explain that the raising of the trumpet and various articles during a seance is accomplished by a force, electrical, magnetic, thrown out from the medium or the bodies of the sitters, and this produces levitation, and the voices, supposed to come from the medium, or confederates, as you so wish to term them, are actually from the realms of thought. The entities may control any part of the medium's body by working through or manipulating the leading nerve center leading to the part they wish to control. Hence, they control the vocal organism and produce voices. I could explain every phrase of mediumship, Mr. Houdini, but it would take up too much of your time, and you perhaps would not care to hear it anyway. I know there are positively genuine mediums, gifted with the same spiritual gifts as the prophets of old, for it is only a natural law, and God, dwelling within nature, makes his laws unchangeable. I had a good laugh over some of your explanations, for you explain things about spiritualism as we would explain the wondrous, mystifying tricks you perform. There is something deep and intangible to it all, if we would only look at things with an unbiased vision. I suggest that the best thing for you to do would be to not dabble in something that pertains to the deeper sciences, if you're so afraid of becoming a victim of hallucinations or a candidate for the insane asylum. J.V. Answer. Madam, there is
$75,000 awaiting the person or medium who can substantiate your claims to the existence of so-called psychic or odic force, or that entities do or can control anything of a phenomenal nature. With all due respect, I would say that my deepest sympathy is extended you, and if you will pardon me, I would advise confining your thoughts to the things of this mundane sphere. Catholicism, the Jewish religion, and all Orthodox religions are established on such facts of spiritual advantage to the human race that there is no comparison between them and a cult. Spiritualism was acknowledged to be a fraud by the Fox sisters, inventors of the myth. Must I keep repeating personally that I am not attacking any religion? I am simply giving the facts of my 30 years of experience as an investigator, and showing that up to the present time it has never come to my lot to meet a genuine medium. And you must concede that in 30 years I ought to run across someone who possesses these powers. Number 14, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My dear Mr. Houdini, I have read your little leaflet given at your performance on February 21st at Carnegie Hall, Pittsburgh, and will give you my impression. I had read press notices and other advertising about the performance, had not seen you before, and was particularly induced to go by the announcement that spiritualistic deceit, treachery, and falsehood would be exposed. I must say I was greatly disappointed. While you did ridicule spiritualism to some extent, yet your talk lacked all convincing argument. Also any comprehensive exposure of methods employed by the mediums, etc. Your talk impressed me as being irrelevant, and you appeared reluctant in dealing with the subject at hand. There may be some cause for this, and I can readily understand your position from a business standpoint. For the enlightened, your appearance may be somewhat encouraging. But for the ignorant spiritualistic believer, you do not demolish any fences. All in all, I went away dissatisfied. This is written in a kindly spirit, and probably I expected a too aggressive lecturer. E.H. Answer. I do not understand why you should be disappointed, because during my lecture I permitted the audience to bombard me with questions, and if there was anything you would like to have known, why didn't you hurl it at me? I want to thank you for the spirit in which your letter was written. There is no such thing as a comprehensive exposure of fraud. All exposures are admitted by the faithful as being tricks, whereas they insist that the identical effect as produced by medium is genuine phenomena. If there is any particular phase that you would like to have explained, I think I can give you the explanation. Number 15, Eyrie, Pennsylvania.
Dear Mr. Houdini, the writer wishes to congratulate you on the wonderful delivery of your lecture in our town on February 22nd. I should like to hear from you whether you can conceive such a thing as creation. The writer considers you one of the masterminds of the world, and I am therefore appealing to your intellectual knowledge and soliciting your ideas in the pure, naked form. As I am not considered one of the tender skins, kindly reply openly. I have an exceptionally intelligent friend by the name of Jacob Lomask, at 1521 State Street, Erie, Pennsylvania. He is the gentleman that was upon the stage, and addressed the audience at your permission. He is an ordained minister of the Spiritualist Church, and I consider him a modernist and a libertarian. With his efforts, I have come to the conclusion that he is fully correct, but of course a modern thinker may change his mind at any moment. At one time, the writer was a rank materialist, believing that we arrive at the cradle and end completely at the grave, but my friend Mr. Lomask has converted me into believing that conscious life is continuous beyond the grave. I am still seeking the supreme ruling powers. Can you enlighten me? I wish to state that you have won a spot in my heart, and I feel as if I know you personally. H.H.C.
Answer. It was an interesting lecture that I had in Erie, and I was much pleased at the way Mr. Jacob Lomask handled the audience regarding his views. There is but one supreme creator. I believe he has no proxies to perform spiritualistic phenomena. Our destiny is in his hands, and we must be submissive to his mandates. There is a vast difference between a spiritual existence and a spiritualistic existence. There has never been any proof shown of a spirit having returned to this mundane sphere that would stand the acid test of scrutiny of investigator or investigation. There are hundreds of books written that spirits had returned, but that is merely conscious or unconscious belief. The Revue de France published an article which it would pay you to read. Number 16, Pasadena, California.
My dear sir, I have read with great interest your first installment in Weird Tales of your exciting experiences with the spirit fakers of Hermannstadt, and wish to say that your name and work have enlisted my vivid interest for some years. Gleaning also from Weird Tales that you are an authority on psychic phenomena and spiritualistic conjectures concerning same, I herewith take advantage of the opportunity offered by Weird Tales to elicit from you, through its columns or otherwise, an expert opinion as to what could have been the underlying causes of the peculiar psychic experiences which came spontaneously to me, utterly uncalled for. I am by nature a born skeptic like yourself, and for the major portion of my life quite an atheist materialist yet. Curiously enough, with a strong leaning toward occultism and a most intense desire for truth in every department of human activity, but particularly as to the claims of our religion and spiritualism, in which by ardent study I have discovered a great affinity as to the claims in each of its psychic phenomena, formerly termed miracles. I have also, like yourself, acquired quite an extensive psychic and spiritualistic library, embracing the fine work of some of the greatest scientists, such as Sir Alfred Russel Wallace, Cesar Lombroso, Sir William Crookes, Dr. Baron von Schrenck-Notzing, Materialization's Phänomen, which I read in the original German edition and parts of which I translated into English for my good friend Dr. Lucian Larkin, astronomer at Mount Lowe Observatory here, who was interested to know of the chemical constituents of the ectoplasm or teleplasm which issues from the bodies of some mediums, such as Marie Barrand, Miss Gulliger, Ava C. Francis Kluski, etc., and which was observed and photographed by Dr. Gelly of Paris, Dr. Crawford of Belfast, Ireland, Dr. Schrenck-Notzing of Munich, etc., etc. This substance, as you undoubtedly know, being the plasm utilized by the invisible spirit or intelligence to build therefrom a temporary body, such as was born on Earth, and for the purpose of identification. Having such books as Dr. William G. Crawford's The Reality of Psychic Phenomena and The Psychic Structures of the Gallagher Circle, von Schrenck-Notzing's big volume with 152 large plate photo flashlight reproductions of his Materialization's Phänomen, and many other similar works, you undoubtedly are familiar with the modus operandi of a strict scientific nature to register the progress of the extraordinary phenomena. I've just finished reading Camille Flammarion's 3 books, the trilogy on death, number 3 on after death especially enlisting my attention, as Mr. Flammarion details hundreds of such extraordinary events, evidently well authenticated, claiming to have in his possession something like 7,000 or 9,000 personal letters from all over the world and covering a wide range of phenomena. I'm curious to learn from you how all such phenomena could be duplicated by trick simulation or by the processes of legerdemain. I've been following with great interest the Scientific American's test procedures under J. Malcolm Burton's chairmanship, and under your and others' collaboration, to land into the net of proof and fact under severe test conditions the various claims of professional mediumship. And if I can judge at least approximately correctly, it seems to me they have already encountered some genuine phenomena. But kindly permit me to ask a specifically important question. If all phenomena of that sort were or could eventually be proven to be individual or collective hallucination or subconscious mind action, both collective and individual, or based upon other purely earthborn, terrestrial, and material conditions, how could so many so-called miracles have been attributed to Jesus the Christ and other biblical supernormal phenomena? Personally, I regard all such genuine phenomena as spiritistic or spiritualistic in origin, and am quite well posted on the Talmudic expurgation's history of Jesus and other non-biblical information of an historical character concerning the psychic medium, as I call him. I think the Bible will eventually stand or fall altogether as an individual receptacle for faith and hope in an individual self-conscious future life after death, by just how much or how far science can or will eventually be able to prove whether any phenomena whatsoever is or can be due to discarnate intelligence or spirits. But I am overstepping the rights of communication, and will merely say in conclusion that I wish you would consider the mental telepathy experiment in my clipping, the Laura to those coming to be revealed, clairaudience sentence and its sequel, the prayer for rain incident, and the terrifying 3 enormous blows on the bedroom closet door after reading and commenting aloud on the revelations of St. John. as these were among the most startling of my California experiences. However, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, my birth and hometown, I had quite a number of other experiences equally, if not more startling, including apparitions of my dead father, 2 of them. And just at a time when I was most unbelieving, atheistic, and leaning altogether to materialistic opinions of being. How my own mind, whether consciously or subconsciously, could produce any of these results, especially when rebellious against all credulity in such matters, I am utterly unable to say or determine. But what I can affirm positively and as fact only is that these things occurred exactly as detailed without an atom of embellishment or exaggeration. I shall await your response with eager interest and am looking forward expectantly to your next installment of the Spirit Fakers of Hermannstadt, Experiences and Weird Tales. L.O. Answer. I've had a similar experience of rain miracle by command, etc. In my case, it was a mere coincidence, and doubtless it was the same in your case. All the scientists you name have been deceived by noted mediums, and there's full proof recorded of such being a fact. The whole subject of occultism is frail. End of Section 6. Section 7 of Weird Tales presents The Strange World of Harry Houdini. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Imprisoned with the Pharaohs, Part 1, by H.P. Lovecraft, as Houdini. Mystery attracts mystery. Ever since the wide appearance of my name as a performer of unexplained feats, I have encountered strange narratives and events, which my calling has led people to link with my interests and activities. Some of these have been trivial and irrelevant, some deeply dramatic and absorbing, some productive of weird and perilous experiences, and some involving me in extensive scientific and historical research. Many of these matters I have told and shall continue to tell very freely, but there is one of which I speak with great reluctance and which I am now relating only after a session of grilling persuasion from the publishers of this magazine, who had heard vague rumors of it from other members of my family. The hitherto guarded subject pertains to my non-professional visit to Egypt 14 years ago, and has been avoided by me for several reasons. For one thing, I am averse to exploiting certain unmistakably actual facts and conditions obviously unknown to the myriad tourists who throng about the pyramids, and apparently secreted with much diligence by the authorities at Cairo, who cannot be wholly ignorant of them. For another thing, I dislike to recount an incident in which my own fantastic imagination must have played so great a part. What I saw, or thought I saw, certainly did not take place, but is rather to be viewed as a result of my then recent readings in Egyptology, and of the speculations anent this theme which my environment naturally prompted. These imaginative stimuli, magnified by the excitement of an actual event terrible enough in itself, undoubtedly gave rise to the culminating horror of that grotesque night so long past. In January 1910, I had finished a professional engagement in England and signed a contract for a tour of Australian theaters. A liberal time being allowed for the trip, I determined to make the most of it, in the sort of travel which chiefly interests me. So, accompanied by my wife, I drifted pleasantly down the continent, and embarked at Marseille on the P&O steamer Malwa, bound for Port Said. From that point I proposed to visit the principal historical localities of Lower Egypt before leaving finally for Australia. The voyage was an agreeable one, and enlivened by many of the amusing incidents which befall a magical performer apart from his work. I had intended, for the sake of quiet travel, to keep my name a secret, but was goaded into betraying myself by a fellow magician whose anxiety to astound the passengers with ordinary tricks tempted me to duplicate and exceed his feats, in a manner quite destructive of my incognito. I mention this because of its ultimate effect, an effect I should have foreseen before unmasking to a shipload of tourists about to scatter throughout the Nile Valley. What it did was to herald my identity wherever I subsequently went, and deprive my wife and me of all the placid inconspicuousness we had sought. Traveling to seek curiosities, I was often forced to stand inspection as a sort of curiosity myself. We had come to Egypt in search of the picturesque and the mystically impressive, but found little enough when the ship edged up to Port Said and discharged its passengers in small boats.
Low dunes of sand, bobbing buoys in shallow water, and a drearily European small town with nothing of interest save the great de Lesseps statue made us anxious to get on to something more worth our while. After our discussion, we decided to proceed at once to Cairo and the pyramids, later going to Alexandria for the Australian boat and for whatever Greco-Roman sites that ancient cosmopolitan metropolis might present. The railway journey was tolerable enough and consumed only 4 hours and a half. We saw much of the Suez Canal, whose route we followed as far as Ismailia, and later had a taste of old Egypt in our glimpse of the restored freshwater canal of the Middle Empire. Then at last we saw Cairo, glimmering through a growing dusk, a twinkling constellation which became ablaze as we halted at the great Gare Centrale. But once more disappointment seemed to await us, for all that we beheld was European save the costumes and the crowds. A prosaic subway led to a square teeming with carriages, taxicabs, and trolley cars, and gorgeous with electric lights shining on tall buildings, whilst the very theatre where I was vainly requested to play, and which I later attended as a spectator, had recently been renamed the American Cosmograph. We stopped at Shepherd's Hotel, reached in a taxi that sped along broad, smartly built-up streets, and amidst the perfect service of its restaurant, elevators, and generally Anglo-American luxuries, the mysterious East and immemorial past seemed very far away. The next day, however, precipitated us delightfully into the heart of the Arabian Nights atmosphere, and in the winding ways and exotic skyline of Cairo, the Baghdad of Harun al-Rashid seemed to live again. Guided by our Baedeker, we had struck east past the Exbekia Gardens along the Mousky in quest of the native quarter, and were soon in the hands of a clamorous cicerone who, notwithstanding later developments, was assuredly a master at his trade. Not until afterward did I see that I should have applied at the hotel for a licensed guide. This man, a shaven, peculiarly hollow-voiced, and relatively cleanly fellow who looked like a pharaoh and called himself Abdul Riz el-Drogman, appeared to have much power over others of his kind, though subsequently the police professed not to know him and to suggest that Riz is merely a name for any person in authority, whilst Drogman is obviously no more than a clumsy modification of the word for a leader of tourist parties, dragoman. Abdul led us among such wonders as we had before only read and dreamed of. Old Cairo is itself a storybook and a dream, labyrinths of narrow alleys redolent of aromatic secrets, arabesque balconies and oriels nearly meeting above the cobbled streets, maelstroms of oriental traffic with strange cries, cracking whips, rattling carts, jingling money, and braying donkeys, kaleidoscopes of polychrome robes, veils, turbans, and tarbushes, water carriers and dervishes, dogs and cats, soothsayers and barbers, and over all the whining of blind beggars crouched in alcoves and the sonorous chanting of muezzins from minarets limned delicately against a sky of deep, unchanging blue. The roofed, quieter bazaars were hardly less alluring. Spice, perfume, incense, beads, rugs, silks, and brass. Old Mahmud Suleiman squats cross-legged amidst his gummy bottles, while chattering youths pulverize mustard in the hollowed-out capital of an ancient classic column, a Roman Corinthian, perhaps from neighboring Heliopolis, where Augustus stationed one of his 3 Egyptian legions. Antiquity begins to mingle with exoticism, and then the mosques in the museum. We saw them all and tried not to let our Arabian revel succumb to the darker charm of pharaonic Egypt, which the museum's priceless treasures offered. That was to be our climax, and for the present we concentrated on the medieval Saracenic glories of the caliphs, whose magnificent tomb mosques formed a glittering fairy necropolis on the edge of the Arabian desert. At length Abdul took us along the Sharia Muhammad Ali to the ancient mosque of Sultan Hassan, and the towel-flanked Bab el-Azab, beyond which climbs the steep wall past the mighty citadel that Saladin himself built with the stones of forgotten pyramids. It was sunset when we scaled that cliff, circled the modern mosque of Muhammad Ali, and looked down from the dizzy parapet over mystic Cairo, all golden with its carven domes, its ethereal minarets, and its flaming gardens. Far over the city towered the great Roman dome of the new museum, and beyond it, across the cryptic yellow Nile that is the mother of aeons and dynasties, lurked the menacing sands of the Libyan desert, undulant and iridescent and evil with older arcana. The red sun sank low, bringing the relentless chill of Egyptian dusk, and as it stood poised on the world's rim like that ancient god of Heliopolis, Re-Harakte, the horizon sun, we saw silhouetted against its vermeil holocaust the black outlines of the pyramids of Giza. The Paleogean tombs that were hoary with 1,000 years when Tutankhamun mounted his golden throne in distant Thebes. Then we knew that we were done with Saracen Cairo and that we must taste the deeper mysteries of primal Egypt, the black Kim of Riand, Amen, Isis, and Osiris. The next morning we visited the pyramids, riding out in a victoria across the great Nile Bridge with its bronze lions, the island of Gizeh with its massive lebbak trees, and the smaller English bridge to the western shore. Down the shore road we drove, between great rows of lebbaks, and past the vast zoological gardens to the suburb of Giza, where a new bridge to Cairo proper has since been built. Then turning inland, along the Sharia el-Haram we crossed a region of glassy canals and shabby native villages, till before us loomed the objects of our quest, cleaving the mists of dawn and forming inverted replicas in the roadside pools. 40 centuries, as Napoleon had told his campaigners there, indeed looked down upon us. The road now rose abruptly till we finally reached our place of transfer between the trolley station and the Mina House Hotel. Abdul Rees, who capably purchased our pyramid tickets, seemed to have an understanding with the crowding, yelling, and offensive Bedouins who inhabited a squalid mud village some distance away, and pestiferously assailed every traveler, for he kept them very decently at bay and secured an excellent pair of camels for us, himself mounting a donkey and assigning the leadership of our animals to a group of men and boys more expensive than useful. The area to be traversed was so small that camels were hardly needed, but we did not regret adding to our experience this troublesome form of desert navigation. The pyramids stand on a high rock plateau, this group forming next to the northernmost of the series of regal and aristocratic cemeteries built in the neighborhood of the extinct capital Memphis, which lay on the same side of the Nile, somewhat south of Giza, and which flourished between 3400 and 2000 BC. The greatest pyramid, which lies nearest the modern road, was built by King Cheops or Khufu about 2800 BC, and stands more than 450 feet in perpendicular height. In a line southwest from this are successively the second pyramid, built a generation later by King Khephren, and though slightly smaller, looking even larger because set on higher ground, and the radically smaller third pyramid of King Mycerinus, built about 2700 BC. Near the edge of the plateau and due east of the second pyramid, with a face probably altered to form a colossal portrait of Khephren, its royal restorer stands the monstrous Sphinx, mute, sardonic, and wise beyond mankind and memory. Minor pyramids and the traces of ruined minor pyramids are found in several places, and the whole plateau is pitted with the tombs of dignitaries of less than royal rank. These latter were originally marked by mastabas, or stone bench-like structures above the deep burial shafts, as found in other Memphian cemeteries, and exemplified by Perneb's tomb in the Metropolitan Museum of New York. At Giza, however, all such visible things have been swept away by time and pillage, and only the rock-hewn shafts, either sand-filled or cleared out by archaeologists, remain to attest their former existence. Connected with each tomb was a chapel in which priests and relatives offered food and prayer to the hovering Ka, or vital principle of the deceased. The small tombs have their chapels contained in their stone mastabas, or superstructures, but the mortuary chapels of the pyramids, where regal pharaohs lay, were separate temples, each to the east of its corresponding pyramid, and connected by a causeway to a massive gate chapel, or propylon at the edge of the rock plateau. The gate chapel leading to the second pyramid, nearly buried in the drifting sands, yawns subterraneously southeast of the Sphinx. Persistent tradition dubs it the Temple of the Sphinx, and it may perhaps be rightly called such, if the Sphinx indeed represents the second pyramid's builder Khephren. There are unpleasant tales of the Sphinx before Khephren, but whatever its elder features were, the monarch replaced them with his own, that men might look at the colossus without fear. It was in the great Gateway Temple that the life-size diorite statue of Khephren, now in the Cairo Museum, was found. A statue before which I stood in awe when I beheld it. Whether the whole edifice is now excavated I am not certain, but in 1910 most of it was below ground, with the entrance heavily barred at night. Germans were in charge of the work, and the war, or other things, may have stopped them. I would give much, in view of my experience and of certain Bedouin whisperings, discredited or unknown in Cairo, to know what has developed in connection with a certain well in a transverse gallery, where statues of the pharaoh were found in curious juxtaposition to the statues of baboons. The road, as we traversed it on our camels that morning, curved sharply past the wooden police quarters, post office, drugstore, and shops on the left, and plunged south and east in a complete bend that scaled the rock plateau and brought us face to face with the desert, under the lee of the Great Pyramid. Past Cyclopean masonry we rode round the eastern face, and looking down ahead into a valley of minor pyramids beyond which the eternal Nile glistened to the east, and the eternal desert shimmered to the west. Very close loomed the three major pyramids, the greatest devoid of outer casing, and showing its bulk of great stones, but the others retaining here and there the neatly fitted covering which had made them smooth and finished in their day. Presently we descended toward the Sphinx, and sat silently beneath the spell of those terrible unseeing eyes. On the vast stone breast we faintly discerned the emblem of Re Harakte, for whose image the Sphinx was mistaken in a late dynasty. And though sand covered the tablet between the great paws, we recalled what Thutmosis IV inscribed thereon, and the dream he had when a prince. It was then that the smile of the Sphinx vaguely displeased us and made us wonder about the legends of subterranean passages beneath the monstrous creature, leading down to the depths none might dare hint at. Depths connected with mysteries older than the dynastic Egypt we excavate, and having a sinister relation to the persistence of abnormal, animal-headed gods in the ancient Nilotic pantheon. Then, too, it was I asked myself an idle question whose hideous significance was not to appear for many an hour. Other tourists now began to overtake us, and we moved on to the sand-choked temple of the Sphinx, 50 yards to the southeast, which I have previously mentioned as the great gate of the causeway to the second pyramid's mortuary chapel on the plateau. Most of it was still underground, and although we dismounted and descended through a modern passageway to its alabaster corridor and pillared hall, I felt that Abdul and the local German attendant had not shown us all there was to see. After this we made the conventional circuit of the pyramid plateau, examining the second pyramid and the peculiar ruins of its mortuary chapel to the east. The third pyramid and its miniature southern satellites and ruined eastern chapel, the rock tombs and honeycombings of the 4th and 5th dynasties, and the famous Campbell's tomb whose shadowy shaft sinks precipitously for 53 feet to a sinister sarcophagus which one of our camel drivers divested of the cumbering sand after a vertiginous descent by rope. Cries now assailed us from the Great Pyramid, where Bedouins were besieging a party of tourists with offers of guidance to the top, or of displays to the speed in the performance of solitary trips up and down. 7 minutes is said to be the record for such an ascent and descent, but many lusty sheiks and sons of sheiks assured us they could cut it to 5 if given the requisite impetus of liberal bakshish. They did not get this impetus, though we did let Abdul take us up, thus obtaining a view of unprecedented magnificence, which included not only remote and glittering Cairo with its crowned citadel and background of gold-violet hills, but all the pyramids of the Memphian district as well, from Abu Roash to the north to the Dashur on the south. The Saqqara Step Pyramid, which marks the evolution of the low mastaba into the true pyramid, showed clearly and alluringly in the sandy distance. It is close to this transition monument that the famed tomb of Perneb was found, more than 400 miles north of the Theban rock valley where Tutankhamun sleeps. Again I was forced to silence through sheer awe. The prospect of such antiquity, and the secrets each hoary monument seemed to hold and brood over, filled me with a reverence and sense of immensity nothing else ever gave me. Fatigued by our climb, and disgusted with the importunate Bedouins whose actions seemed to defy every rule of taste, we omitted the arduous detail of entering the cramped interior passages of any of the pyramids. though we saw several of the hardiest tourists preparing for the suffocating crawl through Cheop's mightiest memorial. As we dismissed and overpaid our local bodyguard and drove back to Cairo with Abdul Rees under the afternoon sun, we half regretted the omission we had made. Such fascinating things were whispered about lower pyramid passages not in the guidebooks, passages whose entrances had been hastily blocked up and concealed by certain uncommunicative archaeologists who had found and begun to explore them. Of course, this whispering was largely baseless on the face of it, but it was curious to reflect how persistently visitors were forbidden to enter the pyramids at night, or to visit the lowest burrows and crypt of the Great Pyramid. Perhaps in the latter case it was the psychological effect which was feared, the effect on the visitor of feeling himself huddled down beneath a gigantic world of solid masonry, joined to the life he has known by the merest tube, in which he may only crawl, in which any accident or evil design might block. The whole subject seemed so weird and alluring that we resolved to pay the Pyramid Plateau another visit at the earliest possible opportunity. For me, this opportunity came much earlier than I expected. That evening, the members of our party feeling somewhat tired after the strenuous program of the day, I went alone with Abdul Rees for a walk through the picturesque Arab quarter. Though I had seen it by day, I wished to study the alleys and bazaars in the dusk, when rich shadows and mellow gleams of light would add to their glamour and fantastic illusion. The native crowds were thinning, but were still very noisy and numerous when we came upon a knot of reveling Bedouins in the Souk-en-Nakassin, or Bazaar of the Coppersmiths. Their apparent leader, an insolent youth with heavy features and saucily cocked tarbush, took some notice of us, and evidently recognized with no great friendliness my competent but admittedly supercilious and sneeringly disposed guide. Perhaps I thought he resented that odd reproduction of the Sphinx's half-smile which I had often remarked with amused irritation. Or perhaps he did not like the hollow and sepulchral resonance of Abdul's voice. At any rate, the exchange of ancestrally opprobrious language became very brisk, and before long Ali Ziz, as I heard the stranger called when called by no worse name, began to pull violently at Abdul's robe. An action quickly reciprocated, and leading to a spirited scuffle in which both combatants lost their sacredly cherished headgear, and would have reached an even direr condition had I not intervened and separated them by main force. My interference, at first seemingly unwelcome on both sides, succeeded at last in effecting a truce. Sullenly each belligerent composed his wrath and his attire, and with an assumption of dignity as profound as it was sudden, the two formed a curious pact of honor, which I soon learned is a custom of great antiquity in Cairo, a pact for the settlement of their difference by means of a nocturnal fistfight atop the Great Pyramid, long after the departure of the last moonlight sightseer. Each duelist was to assemble a party of seconds, and the affair was to begin at midnight, proceeding by rounds in the most civilized possible fashion. In all this planning there was much which excited my interest. The fight itself promised to be unique and spectacular, while the thought of the scene on that hoary pile overlooking the antediluvian plateau of Giza under the wan moon of the pallid small hours appealed to every fiber of imagination in me. A request found Abdul exceedingly willing to admit me to his party of seconds, so that all the rest of the early evening I accompanied him to various dens in the most lawless regions of the town, mostly northeast of the Izbekia, where he gathered one by one a select and formidable band of congenial cutthroats as his pugilistic background. Shortly after 9, our party, mounted on donkeys bearing such royal or tourist-reminiscent names as Ramses, Mark Twain, J.P. Morgan, and Minnehaha, edged through the street labyrinths both oriental and occidental, crossed the muddy and mast-forested Nile by the bridge of the Bronze Lions, and cantered philosophically between the lebbeks on the road to Giza. Slightly over 2 hours were consumed by the trip, toward the end of which we passed the last of the returning tourists, saluted the last inbound trolley car, and were alone with the night and the past and the spectral moon. Then we saw the vast pyramids at the end of the avenue, ghoulish with a dim atavistical menace, which I had not seemed to notice in the daytime. Even the smallest of them held a hint of the ghastly, For was it not in this that they had buried Queen Nitocris alive in the 6th dynasty? Subtle Queen Nitocris, who once invited all her enemies to a feast in a temple below the Nile, and drowned them by opening the water gates. I recalled that the Arabs whispered things about Nitocris and shunned the 3rd pyramid at certain phases of the moon. It must have been overheard that Thomas More was brooding when he wrote of a thing muttered about by Memphian boatmen. The subterranean nymph that dwells, mid sunless gems and glories hid, the Lady of the Pyramid. Early as we were, Ali Ziz and his party were ahead of us, for we saw their donkeys outlined against the desert plateau at Kafr el-Ahram, toward which squalid Arab settlement, close to the Sphinx, we had diverged instead of following the regular road to the Mina house, where some of the sleepy, inefficient police might have observed and halted us. Here, where filthy Bedouins stabled camels and donkeys in the rock tombs of Khephrun's courtiers, we were led up the rocks and over the sand to the Great Pyramid, up whose time-worn sides the Arabs swarmed eagerly, Abdul Rees offering me the assistance I did not need. As most travelers know, the actual apex of this structure has long been worn away, leaving a reasonably flat platform, 12 yards square. On this eerie pinnacle, in a squared circle, was formed, and in a few moments the sardonic desert moon leered down upon a battle which, but for the quality of the ringside cries, might well have occurred at some minor athletic club in America. As I watched it, I felt that some of our less desirable institutions were not lacking. For every blow, feint, and defense bespoke stalling to my not inexperienced eye. It was quickly over, and despite my misgivings as to methods, I felt a sort of proprietary pride when Abdul Rees was adjudged the winner. Reconciliation was phenomenally rapid, and amidst the singing, fraternizing, and drinking which followed, I found it difficult to realize that a quarrel had ever occurred. Oddly enough, I myself seemed to be more of a center of notice than the antagonists, and from my smattering of Arabic I judged that they were discussing my professional performances and escapes from every sort of manacle and confinement, in a manner which indicated not only a surprising knowledge of me, but a distinct hostility and skepticism concerning my feats of escape. It gradually dawned on me that the elder magic of Egypt did not depart without leaving traces, and that fragments of a strange secret lore and priestly cult practices have survived surreptitiously among the fellahin to such an extent that the prowess of a strange Hawi or magician is resented and disputed. I thought about how much my hollow-voiced guide Abdul Rees looked like an old Egyptian priest or pharaoh or smiling sphinx, and wondered. Suddenly something happened which in a flash proved the correctness of my reflections and made me curse the denseness whereby I had accepted this night's events as other than the empty and malicious frame-up they now showed themselves to be. Without warning, and doubtless in answer to some subtle sign from Abdul, the entire band of Bedouins precipitated itself upon me, and having produced heavy ropes, soon had me bound as securely as I was ever bound in the course of my life, either on the stage or off. I struggled at first, but soon saw that one man could make no headway against a band of over 20 sinewy barbarians. My hands were tied behind my back, my knees bent to their fullest extent, and my wrists and ankles stoutly linked together with unyielding cords. A stifling gag was forced into my mouth, and a blindfold fastened tightly over my eyes. Then, as the Arabs bore me aloft on their shoulders and began a jouncing descent of the pyramid, I heard the taunts of my late guide Abdul, who mocked and jeered delightedly in his hollow voice, and assured me that I was soon to have my magic powers put to a supreme test which would quickly remove any egotism I might have gained through triumphing over all the tests offered by America and Europe. Egypt, he reminded me, is very old, and full of inner mysteries and antique powers not even conceivable to the experts of today, whose devices had so uniformly failed to entrap me. How far or in what direction I was carried I cannot tell, for the circumstances were all against the formation of any accurate judgment. I know, however, that it could not have been a great distance, since my bearers at no point hastened beyond a walk, yet kept me aloft a surprisingly short time. It is this perplexing brevity which makes me feel almost like shuddering whenever I think of Giza and its plateau. for one is oppressed by hints of the closeness to everyday tourist routes of what existed then and must exist still. The evil abnormality I speak of did not become manifest at first. Setting me down on a surface which I recognized as sand rather than rock, my captors passed a rope around my chest and dragged me a few feet to a ragged opening in the ground, into which they presently lowered me with much rough handling. For apparent eons I bumped against the stony, irregular sides of a narrow-hewn well, which I took to be one of the numerous burial shafts of the plateau, until the prodigious, almost incredible depth of it robbed me of all basis of conjecture. The horror of the experience deepened with every dragging second. That any descent through the sheer solid rock could be so vast without reaching the core of the planet itself, or that any rope made by man could be so long as to dangle me in these unholy and seemingly fathomless profundities of nether earth, were beliefs of such grotesqueness that it was easier to doubt my agitated senses than to accept them. Even now I am uncertain, for I know how deceitful the sense of time becomes when one or more of the usual perceptions or conditions of life is removed or distorted. But I am quite sure that I preserved a logical consciousness that far, that at least I did not add any full-grown phantoms of imagination to a picture hideous enough in its reality, and explicable by a type of cerebral illusion vastly short of actual hallucination. All this was not the cause of my first bit of fainting. The shocking ordeal was cumulative, and the beginning of the later terrors was a very perceptible increase in my rate of descent. They were paying out that infinitely long rope very swiftly now, and I scraped cruelly against the rough and constricted sides of the shaft as I shot madly downward. My clothing was in tatters, and I felt the trickle of blood all over, even above the mounting and excruciating pain. My nostrils, too, were assailed by a scarcely definable menace, a creeping odor of damp and staleness curiously unlike anything I had ever smelt before, and having faint overtones of spice and incense that lent an element of mockery. Then the mental cataclysm came. It was horrible, hideous beyond all articulate description because it was all of the soul, with nothing of detail to describe. It was the ecstasy of nightmare and the summation of the fiendish. The suddenness of it was apocalyptic and demoniac. One moment I was plunging agonizingly down that narrow well of million-toothed torture, yet the next moment I was soaring on bat wings in the gulfs of hell, swinging free and swoopingly through illimitable miles of boundless, musty space, rising dizzily to measureless pinnacles of chilling ether, then diving gaspingly to sucking nadirs of ravenous, nauseous lower vacua. Thank God for the mercy that shut out in oblivion those clawing furies of consciousness which half unhinged my faculties and tore harpy-like at my spirit. That one respite, short as it was, gave me the strength and sanity to endure those still greater sublimations of cosmic panic that lurked and gibbered on the road ahead. End of section 7. Section 8 of Weird Tales presents The Strange World of Harry Houdini. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Imprisoned with the Pharaohs, Part 2, by H.P. Lovecraft, as Houdini. It was very gradually that I regained my senses after that eldritch flight through the Stygian space. The process was infinitely painful and colored by fantastic dreams in which my bound and gagged condition found singular embodiment. The precise nature of these dreams was very clear, while I was experiencing them, but became blurred in my recollection almost immediately afterward, and was soon reduced to the merest outline by the terrible events, real or imaginary, which followed. I dreamed that I was in the grasp of a great and horrible paw, a yellow, hairy, five-clawed paw which had reached out of the earth to crush and engulf me. And when I stopped to reflect what the paw was, it seemed to me that it was Egypt. In the dream I looked back at the events of the preceding weeks and saw myself lured and enmeshed little by little, subtly and insidiously, by some hellish ghoul spirit of the elder Nile sorcery. Some spirit that was in Egypt before ever man was, and that will be when man is no more. I saw the horror and the unwholesome antiquity of Egypt, and the grisly alliance it has always had with the tombs and temples of the dead. I saw phantom processions of priests with the heads of bulls, falcons, cats, and ibises, phantom processions marching interminably through subterraneous labyrinths and avenues of titanic propylaea, beside which a man is as a fly, and offering unnameable sacrifices to indescribable gods. Stone colossi marched in endless night, and drove herds of grinning andro-sphinxes down to the shores of illimitable, stagnant rivers of pitch, and behind it all I saw the ineffable malignity of primordial necromancy, black and amorphous, and fumbling greedily after me in the darkness to choke out the spirit that had dared to mock it by emulation. In my sleeping brain there took shape a melodrama of sinister hatred and pursuit, and I saw the black soul of Egypt singling me out, and calling me in inaudible whispers, calling me and luring me, leading me on with the glitter and glamour of a Saracenic surface, but ever pulling me down to the age-mad catacombs and horrors of its dead and abysmal pharaonic heart. Then the dream faces took on human resemblances, and I saw my guide Abdul Rees in the robes of a king, with the sneer of the Sphinx on his features, and I knew that those features were the features of Khephren the Great, who raised the second pyramid, carved over the Sphinx's face in the likeness of his own, and built that titanic gateway temple whose myriad corridors the archaeologists think they have dug out of the cryptical sand and the uniformative rock. And I looked at the long, lean, rigid hand of Khephren, the long, lean, rigid hand as I had seen it on the diorite statue in the Cairo Museum, the statue they had found in the terrible Gateway Temple, and wondered that I had not shrieked when I saw it on Abdul Rees. That hand! It was hideously cold, and it was crushing me. It was the cold and cramping of the sarcophagus, the chill and constriction of unrememberable Egypt. It was knighted, necropolitan Egypt itself, that yellow paw, and they whisper such things of Khephren. But at this juncture I began to awake, or at least to assume a condition less completely that of sleep than the one just preceding. I recalled the fight atop the pyramid, the treacherous Bedouins and their attack, my frightful descent by rope through endless rock depths, and my mad swinging and plunging in a chill void redolent of aromatic putrescence. I perceived that I now lay on a damp rock floor, and that my bonds were still biting into me with unloosened force. It was very cold, and I seemed to detect a faint current of noisome air sweeping across me. The cuts and bruises I had received from the jagged sides of the rock shaft were paining me woefully, their soreness enhanced to a stinging or burning acuteness by some pungent quality in the faint draught. And the mere act of rolling over was enough to set my whole frame throbbing with untold agony. As I turned, I felt a tug from above, and concluded that the rope whereby I was lowered still reached to the surface. Whether or not the Arabs still held it, I had no idea, nor had I any idea how far within the earth I was. I knew that the darkness around me was wholly or nearly total, since no ray of moonlight penetrated my blindfold. But I did not trust my senses enough to accept as evidence of extreme depth the sensation of vast duration which had characterized my descent. Knowing at least that I was in a space of considerable extent, reached from the surface directly above by an opening in the rock, I doubtfully conjectured that my prison was perhaps the buried gateway chapel of old Khephren, the temple of the Sphinx, perhaps some inner corridor which the guides had not shown me during my morning visit, and from which I might easily escape if I could find my way to the barred entrance. It would be a labyrinthine wandering, but no worse than others out of which I had in the past found my way. The first step was to get free of my bonds, gag, and blindfold, and this, I knew, would be no great task, since subtler experts than these Arabs had tried every known species of fetter upon me during my long and varied career as an exponent of escape, yet had never succeeded in defeating my methods. Then it occurred to me that the Arabs might be ready to meet and attack me at the entrance upon any evidence of my probable escape from the binding cords, as would be furnished by any decided agitation of the rope, which they probably held. This, of course, was taking for granted that my place of confinement was indeed Khephren Temple of the Sphinx. The direct opening in the roof, wherever it might lurk, could not be beyond easy reach of the ordinary modern entrance near the Sphinx, if in truth it were any great distance at all on the surface, since the total area known to visitors is not at all enormous. I had not noticed any such opening during my daytime pilgrimage, but knew that these things are easily overlooked amid the drifting sands. Thinking these matters over as I lay bent and bound on the rock floor, I nearly forgot the horrors of abysmal descent and cavernous swinging which had so lately reduced me to a coma. My present thought was only to outwit the Arabs, and I accordingly determined to work myself free as quickly as possible, avoiding any tug on the descending line which might betray an effective or even problematical attempt at freedom. This, however, was more easily determined than effected. A few preliminary trials made it clear that little could be accomplished without considerable motion, and it did not surprise me when, after one especially energetic struggle, I began to feel the coils of falling rope as they piled up about me and upon me. Obviously, I thought the Bedouins had felt my movements and released their end of the rope, hastening, no doubt, to the temple's true entrance to lie murderously in wait for me. The prospect was not pleasing, but I had faced worse in my time without flinching and would not flinch now. At present I must first of all free myself of bonds, then trust to ingenuity to escape from the temple unharmed. It is curious how implicitly I had come to believe myself in the old temple of Khephren beside the Sphinx, only a short distance below the ground. That belief was shattered, and every pristine apprehension of preternatural depth and demoniac mystery revived by a circumstance which grew in horror and significance, even as I formulated my philosophical plan. I have said that the falling rope was piling up about and upon me. Now I saw it was continuing to pile as no rope of normal length could possibly do. It gained in momentum and became an avalanche of hemp, accumulating mountainously on the floor and half burying me beneath its swiftly multiplying coils. Soon I was completely engulfed and gasping for breath as the increasing convolutions submerged and stifled me. My senses tottered again, and I vainly tried to fight off a menace, desperate and ineluctable. It was not merely that I was tortured beyond human endurance, not merely that life and breath seemed to be crushed slowly out of me. It was the knowledge of what those unnatural lengths of rope implied, and the consciousness of what was unknown and incalculable gulfs of inner earth must be at this moment surrounding me. My endless descent and swinging flight through goblin space then must have been real, and even now I must be lying helpless in some nameless cavern world toward the core of the planet. Such a sudden confirmation of ultimate horror was insupportable, and the second time I lapsed into merciful oblivion. When I say oblivion, I do not imply that I was free from dreams. On the contrary, my absence from the conscious world was marked by visions of the most unutterable hideousness. God! If only I had not read so much Egyptology before coming to this land, which is the fountain of all darkness and terror. The second spell of fainting filled my sleeping mind anew with shivering realization of the country and its archaic secrets, and through some damnable chance my dreams turned to the ancient notions of the dead and their sojournings in soul and body beyond those mysterious tombs which were more houses than graves. I recalled in dream shapes which it is well that I do not remember the peculiar and elaborate construction of Egyptian sepulchres, and the exceedingly singular and terrific doctrines which determined this construction. All these people thought of was death and the dead. They conceived of a literal resurrection of the body, which made them mummify it with desperate care, and preserve all the vital organs in canopic jars near the corpse, whilst besides the body they believed in two other elements, the soul, which after its weighing and approval by Osiris, dwelt in the land of the blessed, and the obscure and portentous Ka, or life principle, which wandered about the upper and lower worlds in a horrible way, demanding occasional access to the preserved body, consuming the food offerings brought by priests and pious relatives to the mortuary chapel, and sometimes, as men whispered, taking its body or the wooden double always buried beside it, and stalking noxiously abroad on errands peculiarly repellent. For thousands of years these bodies rested gorgeously encased and staring glassily upward when not visited by the Ka, awaiting the day when Osiris should restore both Ka and soul, and lead forth the stiff legions of the dead from their sunken houses of sleep. It was to have been a glorious rebirth, but not all souls were approved, nor were all tombs inviolate, so that certain grotesque mistakes and fiendish abnormalities were to be looked for. Even today the Arabs murmur of unsanctified convocations and unwholesome worship in forgotten nether abysses, which only winged invisible Kas and soulless mummies may visit and return unscathed. Perhaps the most leeringly blood-congealing legends are those which relate to certain perverse products of decadent priestcraft, composite mummies made by the artificial union of human trunks and limbs with the heads of animals in imitation of the elder gods. At all stages of history, the sacred animals were mummified, so that consecrated bulls, cats, ibises, crocodiles, and the like might return some day to greater glory. But only in the decadence did they mix the human and animal in the same mummy, only in the decadence when they did not understand the rights and prerogatives of the Ka and the soul. What happened to those composite mummies is not told of, at least publicly, and it is certain that no Egyptologist ever found one. The whispers of Arabs are very wild, and cannot be relied upon. They even hint that old Khephren, he of the Sphinx, the second pyramid, and the yawning gateway temple, lives far underground wedded to the ghoul queen Nitocris, and ruling over the mummies that are neither of man nor of beast. It was of these, of Khephren and his consort and his strange armies of the hybrid dead, that I dreamed, and that is why I am glad the exact dream shapes have faded from my memory. My most horrible vision was connected with an idle question I had asked myself the day before when looking at the great carven riddle of the desert, and wondering with what unknown depths the temple so close to it might be secretly connected. That question, so innocent and whimsical then, assumed in my dream a meaning of frenetic and hysterical madness. What huge and loathsome abnormality was the Sphinx originally carven to represent? My second awakening, if awakening it was, is a memory of stark hideousness which nothing else in my life, save one thing which came after, can parallel. And that life has been full and adventurous beyond most men's. Remember that I had lost consciousness, whilst buried beneath a cascade of falling rope, whose immensity revealed the cataclysmic depth of my present position. Now as perception returned, I felt the entire weight gone, and realized upon rolling over that although I was still tied, gagged, and blindfolded, some agency had removed completely the suffocating hempen landslide which had overwhelmed me. The significance of this condition, of course, came to me only gradually, but even so I think it would have brought unconsciousness again had I not by this time reached such a state of emotional exhaustion that no new horror could make much difference. I was alone. With what? Before I could torture myself with any new reflection or make any fresh effort to escape from my bonds, an additional circumstance became manifest. Pains not formerly felt were racking my arms and legs, and I seemed coated with a profusion of dried blood, beyond anything my former cuts and abrasions could furnish. My chest, too, seemed pierced by 100 wounds, as though some malign titanic ibis had been pecking at it. Assuredly, the agency which had removed the rope was a hostile one, and had begun to wreak terrible injuries upon me when somehow impelled to desist. Yet at the same time my sensations were distinctly the reverse of what one might expect. Instead of sinking into a bottomless pit of despair, I was stirred to new courage and action, for now I felt that the evil forces were physical things which a fearless man might encounter on an even basis. On the strength of this thought, I tugged again at my bonds, and used all the art of a lifetime to free myself, as I had so often done amidst the glare of lights and the applause of vast crowds. The familiar details of my escaping process commenced to engross me, and now that the long rope was gone, I half regained my belief that the supreme horrors were hallucinations after all, and that there had never been any terrible shaft, measureless abyss, or interminable rope. Was I, after all, in the gateway temple of Khephren beside the Sphinx, and had the sneaking Arabs stolen in to torture me as I lay helpless there? At any rate, I must be free. Let me stand up unbound, ungagged, and with eyes open to catch any glimmer of light, which might come trickling from any source, and I could actually delight in the combat against evil and treacherous foes. How long I took in shaking off my encumbrances I cannot tell. It must have been longer than in my exhibition performances, because I was wounded, exhausted, and enervated by the experiences I had passed through. When I was finally free and taking deep breaths of a chill, damp, evilly spiced air, all the more horrible when encountered without the screen of gag and blindfold edges, I found that I was too cramped and fatigued to move at once. There I lay trying to stretch a frame bent and mangled for an indefinite period, and straining my eyes to catch a glimpse of some ray of light which would give me a hint as to my position. By degrees my strength and flexibility returned, but my eyes beheld nothing. As I staggered to my feet, I peered diligently in every direction, yet met only an ebony blackness, as great as that I had known when blindfolded. I tried my legs, blood encrusted beneath my shredded trousers, and found that I could walk, yet could not decide in what direction to go. Obviously, I ought not to walk at random, and perhaps retreat directly from the entrance I sought, so I paused to note the direction of the cold, fetid, natron-scented air current which I had never ceased to feel. Accepting the point of its source as the possible entrance to the abyss, I strove to keep track of this landmark and to walk consistently toward it. I had had a matchbox with me and even a small electric flashlight, but of course the pockets of my tossed and tattered clothing were long since emptied of all heavy articles. As I walked cautiously in the blackness, the draught grew stronger and more offensive, till at length I could regard it as nothing less than a tangible stream of detestable vapor, pouring out of some aperture like the smoke of the genie from the fisherman's jar in the Eastern tale. The East, Egypt. Truly this dark cradle of civilization was ever the wellspring of horrors and marvels unspeakable. The more I reflected on the nature of this cavern wind, the greater my sense of disquiet became. For although despite its odor I had sought its source, as at least an indirect clue to the outer world, I now saw plainly that this foul emanation could have no admixture or connection whatsoever with the clean air of the Libyan desert, but must be essentially a thing vomited from sinister gulfs still lower down. I had, then, been walking in the wrong direction. After a moment's reflection, I decided not to retrace my steps. Away from the draught, I would have no landmarks, for the roughly level rock floor was devoid of distinctive configurations. If, however, I followed up this strange current, I would undoubtedly arrive at an aperture of some sort, from whose gate I could perhaps work round the walls to the opposite side of this cyclopean and otherwise unnavigable hull. That I might fail, I well realized. I saw that this was no part of Khephen's gateway temple which tourists know, and it struck me that this particular hall might be unknown even to archaeologists, and merely stumbled upon by the inquisitive and malignant Arabs who had imprisoned me. If so, was there any present gate of escape to the known parts or to the outer air? What evidence, indeed, did I now possess that this was the gateway temple at all? For a moment all my wildest speculations rushed back upon me, and I thought of that vivid melange of impressions, descent, suspension in space, the rope, my wounds, and the dreams that were frankly dreams. Was this the end of life for me? Or indeed, would it be merciful if this moment were the end? I could answer none of my own questions, but merely kept on till fate for a third time reduced me to oblivion. This time there were no dreams, for the suddenness of the incident shocked me out of all thought, either conscious or subconscious. Tripping on an unexpected descending step at a point where the offensive draught became strong enough to offer an actual physical resistance, I was precipitated headlong down a black flight of huge stone stairs into a gulf of hideousness unrelieved. That I ever breathe again is a tribute to the inherent vitality of the healthy human organism. Often I look back to that night and feel a touch of actual humor in those repeated lapses of consciousness, lapses whose succession reminded me at the time of nothing more than the crude cinema melodramas of that period. Of course, it is possible that the repeated lapses never occurred, and that all the features of that underground nightmare were merely the dreams of one long coma, which began with the shock of my descent into that abyss, and ended with the healing balm of the outer air and of the rising sun, which found me stretched on the sands of Giza before the sardonic and dawn-flushed face of the great Sphinx. I prefer to believe this latter explanation as much as I can, hence was glad when the police told me that the barrier to Khephren gateway temple had been found unfastened, and that a sizable rift to the surface did actually exist in one corner of the still-buried part. I was glad, too, when the doctors pronounced my wounds only those to be expected from my seizure. Blinding, lowering, struggling with bonds, falling some distance, perhaps into a depression in the temple's inner gallery, dragging myself to the outer barrier and escaping from it. And experiences like that. A very soothing diagnosis, and yet I know that there must be more than appears on the surface. That extreme descent is too vivid a memory to be dismissed. And it is odd that no one has ever been able to find a man answering the description of my guide Abdul Rees El Drogman, the tomb-throated guide who looked and smiled like King Khephren. I have digressed from my connected narrative, perhaps in the vain hope of evading the telling of that final incident, that incident which, of all, is most certainly an hallucination, but I promised to relate it and do not break promises. When I recovered, or seemed to recover, my senses, after that fall down the black stone stairs, I was quite as alone and in darkness as before. The windy stench, bad enough before, was now fiendish, yet I had acquired enough familiarity by this time to bear it stoically. Dazedly, I began to crawl away from the place whence the putrid wind came, and with my bleeding hands felt the colossal blocks of a mighty pavement. Once my head struck against a hard object, and when I felt of it, I learned that it was the base of a column of unbelievable immensity, whose surface was covered with gigantic chiseled hieroglyphics, very perceptible to my touch. Crawling on, I encountered other Titan columns at incomprehensible distances apart, when suddenly my attention was captured by the realization of something which must have been impinging on my subconscious hearing long before the conscious sense was aware of it. From some still lower chasm in earth's bowels were proceeding certain sounds, measured and definite, and like nothing I had ever heard before. That they were very ancient and distinctly ceremonial I felt almost intuitively, and much reading in Egyptology led me to associate them with the flute, the sambuke, the sistrum, and the tympanum. In their rhythmic piping, droning, rattling, and beating I felt an element of terror beyond all the known terrors of earth, a terror peculiarly dissociated from personal fear, and taking the form of a sort of objective pity for our planet. That it should hold within its depths such horrors as must lie behind these Aegyptianic cacophonies. The sounds increased in volume, and I felt that they were approaching. Then, and may all the gods of all pantheons unite to keep the like from my ears again, I began to hear faintly and far off the morbid and millennial trumping of the marching things. It was hideous that footfalls, so dissimilar, should move in such perfect rhythm. The training of unhallowed thousands of years must lie behind that march of earth's inmost monstrosities. Padding, clicking, walking, stalking, rumbling, lumbering, crawling, and all to the abhorrent discords of those mocking instruments. And then, God keep the memory of those Arab legends out of my head, the mummies without souls, the meeting place of the wandering gods, the hordes of the devil-cursed pharaonic dead of 40 centuries. The composite mummies led through the uttermost onyx voids by King Khephren and his ghoul queen, Nitocris. The tramping grew nearer. Heaven save me from the sound of those feet and paws and hooves and pads and talons as it commenced to acquire detail. Down limitless reaches of sunless pavement, a spark of light flickered in the malodorous wind, and I drew behind the enormous circumference of a cyclopic column that I might escape for a while the horror that was stalking million-footed towards me through gigantic hypostyles of inhuman dread and phobic antiquity. The flickers increased, and the tramping and dissonant rhythm grew sickeningly loud. In the quivering orange light there stood faintly forth a scene of such stony awe that I gasped from a sheer wonder that conquered even fear and repulsion. bases of columns whose middles were higher than human sight, mere bases of things that must each dwarf the Eiffel Tower to insignificance, hieroglyphics carved by unthinkable hands in caverns where daylight can be only a remote legend. I would not look at the marching things. That I desperately resolved as I heard their creaking joints and nitrous wheezing above the dead music and the dead tramping. It was merciful that they did not speak, but God, their crazy torches began to cast shadows on the surface of those stupendous columns. Heaven take it away! Hippopotami should not have human hands and carry torches. Men should not have the heads of crocodiles. I tried to turn away, but the shadows and the sounds and the stench were everywhere. Then I remembered something I used to do in half-conscious nightmares as a boy, and began to repeat to myself, "This is a dream. This is a dream." But it was of no use, and I could only shut my eyes and pray. At least that is what I think I did, for one is never sure in visions, and I know that this can have been nothing more. I wondered whether I should ever reach the world again, and at times would furtively open my eyes to see if I could discern any feature of the place other than the wind of spiced putrefaction, the topless columns, and the thaumatropically grotesque shadows of abnormal horror. The sputtering glare of multiplying torches now shone, and unless this hellish place were wholly without walls, I could not fail to see some boundary or fixed landmark soon. But I had to shut my eyes again when I realized how many of the things were assembling, and when I glimpsed a certain object walking solemnly and steadily, without any body above the waist. A fiendish and ululent corpse gurgle or death rattle now split the very atmosphere, the charnel atmosphere poisonous with naphtha and bitumen blasts, in one concerted chorus from the ghoulish legion of hybrid blasphemies. My eyes, perversely shaken open, gazed for an instant upon a sight which no human creature should ever imagine without panic, fear, and physical exhaustion. The things had filed ceremoniously in one direction, the direction of the noisome wind, where the light of their torches showed their bended heads, or the bended heads of such as had heads. They were worshipping before a great black photor-belching aperture, which reached up almost out of sight, and which I could see was flanked at right angles by two giant staircases whose ends were far away in shadow. One of these was indubitably the staircase I had fallen down. The dimensions of the whole were fully in proportion with those of the columns. An ordinary house would have been lost in it, and any average public building could easily have been moved in and out. It was so vast a surface that only by moving the eye could one trace its boundaries, so vast, so hideously black, and so aromatically stinking. Directly in front of this yawning, polyphemus door, the things were throwing objects, evidently sacrifices or religious offerings, to judge by their gestures. Kephren was their leader, sneering King Kephren, or the guide Abdul Rees, crowned with a golden pshent, and intoning endless formulae with the hollow voice of the dead. By his side knelt beautiful Queen Nitocris, whom I saw in profile for a moment, noting that the right half of her face was eaten away by rats or other ghouls, and I shut my eyes again when I saw what objects were being thrown as offerings to the fetid aperture, or its possible local deity. It occurred to me that, judging from the elaborateness of this worship, the concealed deity must be one of considerable importance. Was it Osiris or Isis, Horus or Anubis, or some vast unknown god of the dead still more central and supreme? There is a legend that terrible altars and colossi were reared to an unknown one before ever the known gods were worshipped. And now, as I steel myself to watch the rapt and sepulchral adorations of those nameless things, a thought of escape flashed upon me. The hall was dim and the columns heavy with shadow. With every creature of that nightmare throng absorbed in shocking raptures, it might be barely possible for me to creep past to the faraway end of one of the staircases and ascend unseen, trusting to fate and skill to deliver me from the upper reaches. Where I was I neither knew nor seriously reflected upon, and for a moment it struck me as amusing to plan a serious escape from that which I knew to be a dream. Was I in some hidden and unsuspected lower realm of Kefren's gateway temple? That temple which generations have persistently called the Temple of the Sphinx? I could not conjecture, but I resolved to ascend to life and consciousness if wit and muscle could carry me. Wriggling flat on my stomach, I begun the anxious journey toward the foot of the left-hand staircase, which seemed the more accessible of the two. I cannot describe the incidents and sensations of that crawl, but they may be guessed when one reflects on what I had to watch steadily in that malign, wind-blown torchlight in order to avoid detection. The bottom of the staircase was, as I have said, far away in shadow, as it had to be to rise without a bend to the dizzy parapeted landing above the Titanic aperture. This placed the last stages of my crawl at some distance from the noisome herd, though the spectacle chilled me even when quite remote at my right. At length I succeeded in reaching the steps and begun to climb, keeping close to the wall, on which I observed decorations of the most hideous sort, and relying for safety on the absorbed, ecstatic interest with which the monstrosities watched the foul-breezed aperture and the impious objects of nourishment they had flung on the pavement before it. Though the staircase was huge and steep, fashioned of vast porphyry blocks, as if for the feet of a giant, the ascent seemed virtually interminable. Dread of discovery and the pain which renewed exercise had brought to my wounds combined to make that upward crawl a thing of agonizing memory. I had intended, on reaching the landing, to climb immediately onward along whatever upper staircase might mount from there, stopping for no last look at the carrion abominations that pawed and genuflected some 70 or 80 feet below. Yet a sudden repetition of that thunderous corpse gurgle and death rattle chorus, coming as I had nearly gained the top of the flight and showing by its ceremonial rhythm that it was not an alarm of my discovery, caused me to pause and peer cautiously over the parapet. The monstrosities were hailing something which had poked itself out of the nauseous aperture to seize the hellish fare proffered it. It was something quite ponderous even as seen from my height, something yellowish and hairy and endowed with a sort of nervous motion. It was as large, perhaps, as a good-sized hippopotamus, but very curiously shaped. It seemed to have no neck, but 5 separate shaggy heads, springing in a row from a roughly cylindrical trunk, the first very small, the second good-sized, the third and fourth equal and largest of all, and the fifth rather small, though not so small as the first. Out of these heads darted curious rigid tentacles, which seized ravenously on the excessively great quantities of unmentionable food placed before the aperture. Once in a while the thing would leap up, and occasionally it would retreat into its den in a very odd manner. Its locomotion was so inexplicable that I stared in fascination, wishing it would emerge farther from the cavernous lair beneath me. Then it did emerge. It did emerge, and at the sight I turned and fled into the darkness up the higher staircase that rose behind me. Fled unknowingly up incredible steps and ladders and inclined planes to which no human sight or logic guided me, and which I must ever relegate to the world of dreams for want of any confirmation. It must have been dream, or the dawn would never have found me breathing on the sands of Giza before the sardonic dawn-flushed face of the Great Sphinx. The Great Sphinx! God! That idle question I asked myself on that sun-blessed morning before. What huge and loathsome abnormality was the Sphinx originally carven to represent? Accursed is the sight, be it in dream or not, that revealed to me the supreme horror, the unknown god of the dead which licks its colossal chops in the unsuspected abyss, fed hideous morsels by soulless absurdities that should not exist. The 5-headed monster that emerged, the 5-headed monster as large as a hippopotamus, the 5-headed monster, and that of which it is the merest forepaw. But I survived, and I know it was only a dream. End of Section 8. End of Weird Tales Presents The Strange World of Harry Houdini.